Something very strange happens when you time travel in One Piece, a phenomena of which we have had multiple examples. You may think that it's just Kozuki Toki's devil fruit, but time travel and time manipulation was actually a well-explored aspect of this world long before we reached Toki. And contrary to her rules and restrictions, we have at least one confirmed example of backwards time travel in One Piece. Except it came with something quite strange that may inform us of the very nature of time in the One Piece universe. Something that people like me, obsessive men on the internet, need to learn to grapple with in regards to One Piece is that time is fundamentally different in this world. They use the same measurements as us, days, years, minutes, hours, the rest, but very rarely do those measurements make sense. For example, all of the following events that I am about to say happened in a single day. Luffy set out to sea, he met Kobe, defeated Alvida, met Zoro, recruited Zoro, got his head stuck in a bird, met Nami, kicked a clown in the balls, recruited Nami, met a man in a box, but not in the anime, that happens later, but in the manga it happens now, and then he met Usopp and we stayed up all night, and that is the very first night in One Piece. Everything that happened prior to Syrup Village, and even some of Syrup Village, happened within a single day. And for a more isolated example, there's the pretty notorious Dressrosa, as essentially an entire arc took place within a couple of hours. We arrived on the island in the morning, and by afternoon tea, Doflamingo had been defeated and the entire nation had been, well, it's not what it once was. Days are very, very long in the One Piece world. And so are the nights, which makes certain elements like Blackbeard allegedly being unable to sleep especially tragic, because as a child, he would have had to spend extremely long periods of time all alone whilst everyone else was blissfully sleeping. Now, part of this may have to do with the size of the One Piece planet, which is it's a lot bigger than what I've got. The One Piece world is actually unbelievably colossal. And this is on purpose because when designing major islands, Oda gives himself a blank canvas of a very classical measurement of 1,000 ri wide and tall, meaning that almost every island in the series is the size of Australia, which if you look at it on a map, it's pretty damn big. Not a lot of it is livable, especially with all the deserts and the drop bears, but it is big nonetheless. And the world of One Piece is said to have tens of millions of islands. Just imagine that, tens of millions of Australias. You could only wish you were that lucky. And these are all based on measurements given by Oda himself, and I've got a whole video waiting here if you'd like to get into the detail of planet sizing, because there's a lot to digest. But for now, the point of this video is that time is weird. Time in the One Piece world does operate on our 24-hour system. Exact times are very rarely mentioned, but they do pop up now and then, and Oda has gone through and detailed how many hours of sleep the Straw Hats get per night. Most get between 5 to 8 hours, except for Zoro, who only gets 3, but that's the reason why he's always falling asleep throughout the day. But Oda using the word hours loses all meaning when we realize that we don't even know how long an hour in this world is. The times do not make sense, especially with travel distances. Sometimes it takes the equivalent of a week of sailing to complete the distance equivalent to circumnavigating our globe on a sailboat. Now with that in mind, let's talk about direct time manipulation in the form of Kozuki Toki, previously known as Amatsuki Toki, who possesses the Toki Toki no Mi, the time fruit, which allows her to send herself or anyone she chooses a predetermined amount of time into the future, which Toki has rather thoroughly abused, as she was actually born during the Void Century and has used this devil fruit to jump all the way to 20 years ago. In Toki's case, this was because she was looking for Wano. Toki was not born there, but she knew that her parents were from there. However, she was very happy to put that to the side and sail with Kozuki Oden because, and I quote, "Just being around you makes me feel like I've already reached my destination." Very romantics. And we still don't know the full story behind Toki, and I'm looking forward to an eventual Toki flashback where we see her entire journey through 800 years of history. But what's more relevant for now is Toki's forward restriction, which is very interesting because despite the fact that she cannot travel back in time, Toki is a character who seems to innately understand what the future holds to a scarily accurate detail. Going back on Kozuki Oden's story, Toki shows a lot of emotion, but one emotion she never shows is surprise. There's never like a ah. When she falls ill, Toki makes sure that Oden continues with Roger to laugh tale. When Oden makes a deal for some Neki dancing, she tears up over Oden's pain, but she never asks him why he's doing it or suggests that he stops. And when Oden asks if Toki wants a divorce, she just laughs it off. When Orochi alters the deal with Oden, she watches him break down as if this was a moment she knew would always come. And when Yasu says that they need to be prepared for Oden to lose, Toki seems to understand Yasu's words better than he does. Nothing that happens ever surprises Toki, and she always seems to understand exactly what her role in these events is to be, which would be understandable if she could travel, back and forth in time. Having seen the future, she would know how to act, but apparently she can't do that because because of magical fruit restrictions. And Toki's abilities could have changed a lot of things. For example, she could have sent Odin 20 years into the future, or even herself, instead of staying on Wano to die. But Toki did not do that, because she somehow seems to understand that everyone and everything has their exact purpose. In Odin's case, the people needed to hear his final message, which changed the opinion of the Flower Capital residents of the Kozuki clan, and may have helped prepare for the eventual opening of the borders of Wano for Joy Boy. And in Toki's case, it may have been extremely important for her to stay and die delivering the prophecy, because it installed paranoia within Kurozumi Orochi and influenced his actions over the next 20 years. You are the moon, unaware of the dawn. May your purpose be fulfilled, and cast 9 shadows on the night woven of 20 years, and you shall know the brilliance of dawn. The idea here is that Toki and Odin are weaving this ultimate night, so they need to stay to do said weaving. And also that this may have much greater meaning beyond simply Wano's salvation, that all of this is necessary for the eventual dawn of the world. Although I should say that in the manga, Toki's death is incredibly vague. It's implied that she died, and given that this is One Piece, implications of death are very hard to trust, and so I'm still waiting for the potential day when she rocks up 20 years into the future somewhere. But if you watch the anime, then she does look a lot more dead in that. And as alluded to before, there are a handful of other fictional fruits in the series that do manipulate time. Foxy's Noronoro is a prime example, slowing down anything touched by the Norima photons by 30 seconds, which notably is still not travel back in time, it's just slowing forward time progression for a bit. Alternatively, Shinobu's Juku Juku no Mi can also be considered a form of time manipulation, as it can speed up the age of objects or persons targeted, one of which was Momonosuke, thus making him the subject of 2 separate forms of time manipulation in the series after being sent 20 years into the future by Toki and having his body aged by 20 years by Shinobu. Again though, this is strictly forward manipulation, and Shinobu even issues a pretty stern warning that what she does cannot be undone. We cannot travel back into the time. The rules of devil fruits that dip into time are pretty consistent. Powers move forwards, not backwards. And even Princess Manashari's Chiyu Chiyu fruit is effectively speeding up the healing and rebuilding process. It is not restoring people to health. And this is because Manashari cannot create body parts if they're missing. Those body parts can be reattached, but she can't actually restore a body to how it once was if something is missing. And the reason for that is because she cannot travel backwards in time, only forwards, only speed up the healing process. And so backwards time travel or manipulation must be impossible, right? Well, that's what story lord Eiichiro Oda would have you think up until a certain point. But first, let's address the meta concern about being able to travel back in time, which would be that it simply creates too many narrative headaches. Toki's restriction of only being able to travel forward in time is extremely necessary, because if she could travel backwards, then it breaks the logic of why anything actually needed to happen. If Toki could go back and inform people of exactly what was coming, then there would be no Void Century, and we'd all be living happily ever after right now, except for us in the real world, because there would be no One Piece because nothing interesting is happening. But this decision also has quite a strong basis in real life. Traveling forward in time is actually something considered relatively easy by sciencemen on the planet, and it has been proven that the faster you travel, the slower time ticks for you. So there's a really cool experiment called the Haffel-Keating experiment, which loaded 2 planes chock full of atomic clocks and also kept 1 set of atomic clocks on the ground. And they had those 2 planes fly in opposite directions around the planet, one with the Earth's rotation and one against it. And what they found when those planes landed is that all of the clocks were different. One plane had experienced time faster, about 273 nanoseconds faster, whilst the other plane experienced time slower, about 59 nanoseconds slower than the clocks on the ground. I suppose proving that if you were to take the slower version of that to an extreme level, then you could put yourself in the position of experiencing time slower than a designated target, and therefore travel forward in time by removing yourself from the time it is that you want to travel forward into. If that makes sense, I think it does. However, what we cannot do is travel back in time. The options we have are to either experience time at a slower rate or a faster rate, but we can still only go forward. And there's actually a very prominent Albathian theory that relates to this, which all has to do with the very sinister warning that we were given at the end of chapter 1132. Everything is breathtakingly huge. Adventurers, do not regret your lost time here. However, if there is one message you take away from my account of the gigantic and mystical lands of Elbaf, let it be this word of warning: do not overstay your welcome here. That was the very sinister warning we were given by the word of Louis Arnaud, explorer from some time in the past. We don't know exactly when. But this has led to the wild theory that time operates differently differently on Elbaf than it does in the rest of the One Piece world. This is because of the specific warning of not regretting lost time, which could just be fanciful, florid language, but losing time is a very interesting idea because I feel like you're more likely to refer to it as spending time generally. We are spending time on Elbaf. It is a resource that we have dedicated to this adventure, and why would I regret spending time on this island? Whereas losing time, it implies that it has been stolen from us. Someone has thieved time from our time pocketses. And so that implies something else entirely. And coupled with the final line about not staying too long, it has spawned the thought that time on Elbaf may move slower compared to the rest of the planet, and say that every hour on Elbaf is a day, week, or month in the One Piece world, which the Giants don't notice because they live insanely long lives by default, and the rapid passage of time of humanity outside of their borders is quite natural to them. And we do actually have a potential example of this effect in action. This could be, and probably is, another completely innocent line, but in chapter 1076, Mr. Sir Shanks is seen on Elbaf and he says, "Think I spent a bit too much time talking," before deciding to set sail and defeat Eustace Kidd. But Kidd wasn't who Shanks was setting out to target originally. It was actually Bartolomeo, who had commandeered one of Shanks's New World islands. Now, what makes this strange is that Shanks declared that he was setting sail to defeat Bartolomeo and retake his territory on March 24th, which was the day that he did his Wano drive-by. But Shanks didn't actually arrive until after April 12th, which was after the Egghead incident, which is an awfully long time considering that Shanks is the man who traveled from his territory in the New World to Marineford in the first half of the Grand Line within the span of a couple of hours during the Paramount War. So why did it take Shanks 21 whole days to cover a significantly shorter distance? Well, that may be because there was one tricksy stop on that journey. Shanks went to the giant pub for a drink and caught up with Dory and Broggy, and by his own admission, he spent a bit too much time talking. Time that could have equated to weeks and given us this delay. Now, to be very, very clear, at the time of this recording, I think this idea is very much on the crackpot side of the spectrum. However, another thing it would explain is why we haven't cut to the outside world at all since reaching Elbaf. With our previous big arcs, Wano and Egghead Island, Oda was very conscious about showing us what was happening elsewhere in the world at regular intervals and constructing a very solid and meticulous timeline of events playing out in tandem with our main adventures. But there has been none of that on Elbaf so far. We are completely isolated, and it would be a pretty insane twist to leave this island and discover that we've had a whole second time skip happen in the outside world. But look, even if this crazy theory was true, all it does is add to the idea that time only moves forward. Sure, it can be slower in certain locations, but it can never move backwards, which is completely in line with the general themes of One Piece. It's all about moving on to the next generation, moving on to the next challenge by the island arc system and never going backwards, and even moving on to the next world and leaving this one behind, at least according to the prophecies of the Harley text. But there is one exception that breaks our time theory, because Toki and all of the others I said are not the only people with access to time manipulation, as Jewelry Bonnie has the Toshi Toshi no Mi, which roughly translates as the age fruit, although we know that age doesn't quite sum up the extent of its abilities. In a way, this fruit is very much the opposite of Toki's. Toki sent people into the future, so it moved time around them, or it moved them through time, whereas Bonnie inflicts time on the body of the target as well as herself whilst remaining in the present. And there is one extremely big difference here that breaks our entire theory of time, which is that Bonnie is capable of de-aging her targets. She can manipulate their bodies to move back in time, which is normally used to turn big scary marine men into pants-soiling crybabies. But regardless, with everything we know about the rules of time in One Piece, this should not be possible. This is blatant backwards time travel. But it is possible because in One Piece, anything that humanity can imagine just becomes very possible. And given that Bonnie's abilities are an inverse of Toki's, with one speeding up the environment around a target and one manipulating a target within the environment, does that mean that a direct opposite of Toki's Devil Fruit could exist? One which only allows its user to go back in time? Or if science were to advance far enough, could we unlock this idea without the need for fictional fruit? All I know is that at the very least, Bonnie has has provided a point of evidence that this is not in fact impossible. Although one of the big secrets to Bonnie's abilities is that she can also dip into alternate realities, and this tends to manifest alternate futures, like the one where she's biologically a buccaneer, or more recently where she is the sun god Nika. And so I guess one way to potentially explain the de-aging is that Bonnie is creating younger alternate future versions. For example, when she de-aged Dr. Vegapunk, this was definitely an alternate Vegapunk because he still had the apple on his head, which his younger self in this world certainly would not have. And the idea here is that we have gone so far into the future that time has gone all cyclical. We've hit a repeating cycle, and Jewelry Bonnie isn't de-aging people. What she's doing is aging them so unbelievably far into the future that she's accessing alternate versions of them through different time cycles, thousands and thousands of years from where we are right now. Because that is another very tricky thing about One Piece. As much as all of the everything I've said is about pushing forward and never looking back, One Piece is ultimately kind of a quest to return to the past. We're trying to revive the old world that currently lay dormant beneath the great oceans of the planet. We're trying to reach the levels of technology that we once had 800 to 900 years ago, and we are trying to restore the planet back to its pre-Void Century state. Our future is the past, and our past is the future. If nothing else, Egghead Island definitely made that very clear. We spent all that time on the most advanced and most futuristic island we will ever set foot on, and the whole arc was thematically about returning to the past, and that what the future has in store for us could be found 800 to 900 years ago. And while time travel backwards may not be possible, it would appear that if you travel far enough into the future, then you are effectively going backwards, and this universe may very well be destined to play out the very same cycle of going from A to B, then back to A, then back to B, then back to A, and B again for all eternity. Mr. Monkey D. Luffy is a pretendee heir to the Sun God throne. He is but a replica of the Sun God, achieved by the powers of fictional fruit. But who is the real Sun God? Well, a certain Prince Loki of another certain Elbaf would claim that it's him, but I am afraid that there is only one character who fulfills all of the criteria of hope, laughter, and the liberation that Nika brings, and that man is a clown. Early on in Eiichiro Oda's journey as a mangaka, he created a clown named Boogie, who is intended to be a more serious and legitimately terrifying Joker style of character. However, this design and persona softened over time to a character who now occupies the role of series jester. Although he would still be named Boogie to this very day if Eiichiro Oda hadn't seen The Nightmare Before Christmas and said to himself, damn, Boogie's already taken, oh well, I'll name him Buggy, which is a thought Oda recalls took him exactly 0.2 seconds to process. But Buggy as we know him was created for comedy, and Oda was once asked why Buggy has such a big red round nose, and Oda answered, so that he looks like a clown, of course. This was way back in the East Blue Saga, and so Oda says of course as if that made sense to anyone except him at the time. But it does, admittedly, make an awful lot of sense now. And in retrospect, Buggy was even using his own version of Gear 5th long before Luffy was using Gear anything. Buggy is very consistently portrayed in One Piece as a cartoon. He even has his very own specific cartoon trait, which is his teeth popping out of his mouth when he's particularly shocked. And the funny thing is, there's even a perfectly legitimate in-world explanation for this, as his teeth can indeed separate using the Chop Chop fruit. And furthermore, Buggy's cartoonish influence even goes on to affect those around him, just like Luffy's eventual awakening would. A great example of which is that after spending ever so much time together during Impel Down, even Mr. Three's teeth, nose, and eyes started popping out alongside Buggy's. So there was a time where I would have dismissed this as creative license. This isn't, literally happening. It's Oda using the manga medium to create a sense of heightened emotion. But after Gear 5th, mate, I don't know if I'm sure about any of that anymore. Because we now live in a world where comedy is tangible. And that makes Buggy, unironically, one of the most powerful characters as a literal clown commanding a literal circus. And so long as he's funny, no lasting harm will come to him. For example, we can plonk this jester smack bang in the middle of the Paramount War with all of the most powerful people. He can be attacked by all three admirals and still be okay afterwards. Of course, Buggy can't beat any of the admirals in a straight fight like Luffy should be able to these days, but not even a Marine admiral can take Buggy down. They've tried. He can be sliced in half, he can turn himself into a car, he can get kicked in the nuts, he even has his own chibi form like Luffy's post-Gear 3rd exhaustion, and his entire life is a farce that provides on-demand comedy at every moment, such as when he ate his devil fruit. He deep-throated that bad boy, and his tragedy is our comedy. The way I describe it is, with Luffy, we're laughing with him. We feel joy when he feels joy. But with Buggy, we're laughing at him. We feel joy at his misfortune, which often turns out to be fortune in a very roundabout way. And Buggy also gets caught up easily in the flow of others to great comic effect. One of my favorite Buggy gags in the entire series actually is during Jaya, when he and his crew are looking for Captain John's treasure in a cave, which turns out to be a mine, and Buggy gets mistaken for a new employee and actually starts mining with them, saying, it feels good to work up a sweat. A cold brew after hard labor is really refreshing, before promptly snapping out of it and saying, what the crap am I doing? But I can tell that this was one of Oda's favorite jokes at the time as well, because on the cover of volume 25, Oda drew all of the characters set against the mine and even added this head miner in the background, giving a thumbs up. Even though this dude only appeared in a total of 2 panels, he was still graced with the cover. And it's also worth mentioning that volume 25, intentionally or not, shows the future 4 emperors of One Piece: Luffy, Shanks, Blackbeard, and Buggy. And this cover would go on to be recreated for volume 105 after they officially became the 4 emperors. Buggy is Oda's favorite villain, and you can definitely tell because he puts that same kind of love and creativity into Buggy that he does with Luffy. In fact, Oda's favorite characters in general tend to be the ones that make him laugh the most, because that is the overall mission of One Piece, to spread joy and laughter. And even Buggy's devil fruit abilities allow him to fight with the same sort of freedom as Luffy, because it is practically impossible to damage Buggy. There is always an absurd, cartoonish, and comical way that he can maneuver in any combat scenario, and it's at the point where not even the world's greatest swordsman succeeded in harming Buggy during the Paramount War. And the only time that Buggy does get actually hurt is for our amusement. But also, this is an anime exclusive thing, but within the Toei anime, Buggy breaks the 4th wall a lot. He addresses the watchers and makes it seem like he knows that he's a character in a TV show, which is a wall that not even Luffy can shatter with Gear 5th yet, but overall Buggy overwhelmingly passes our first Sun God criteria of bringing joy, as this dude is beyond hilarious, and it always puts a smile on my face to see Buggy appear on page or on screen. So let us now turn to Liberation, and our obvious next stop here would be Impel Down. Following this incident, Buggy the Clown was considered to be one of the 2 nefarious masterminds of the prison break alongside Luffy, and in the eyes of the world, everything that happened during Impel Down and Marineford had Luffy and Buggy sharing the stage equally. And while this is played for comedy, because, you know, that's the jester, I still don't think it's entirely inaccurate for the Marines to have given Buggy all that credit, as he was orchestrating his own riot and his own separate jailbreak alongside Luffy's. Come on, men, now's our chance. If you want a taste of freedom, make as much trouble as you can. And to the prisoners, think about it from their perspective. Buggy would have looked like a modern incarnation of Nika, this wacky clown man just coming and freeing everyone. Let the games begin. Captain Buggy's our savior, the prisoners yelled as they were overwhelmed with hope, joy, and liberation. And throughout the jailbreak, Buggy's prisoners also sing and dance their way to freedom. It was definitely a lot more wacky and fun than Luffy's story thread happening on the lower levels, which is crazy to think about because he had all the Okama on his side. But in regards to liberation, without Buggy freeing those level 2 prisoners, Magellan's full attention would have been on Luffy right from the start of the prison break, which likely would have doomed his effort to fail. And without Buggy's 3rd faction emerging, Magellan also may not have seen it as necessary to free Shiryu to handle the Blackbeard pirates, meaning that both Luffy and Blackbeard's forces likely would have both fallen to Magellan. Although it should be said that Luffy, Blackbeard, and Buggy were all essential factors in Impel Down. Without any one of them, the other 2 fail. And there's also something very special to be said about the fact that Buggy never needed to be liberated by Luffy in Impel Down, unlike most of the other prisoners. Buggy had already managed to escape his cell and his shackles by the time that Luffy snuck in. Buggy was just free by nature. And furthermore, he and Mr. 3 made it all the way from level 5 to level 1 with no help from Luffy either. That is a pretty monumental achievement that is overshadowed by the everything else that happened during the arc. But what I will say, right, is that Luffy, he actually gets captured during the Impel Down arc. Buggy does not. He remains free for the entire arc. Granted, he did have to be caught to begin with, and Buggy does get captured much later on by Mihawk and Crocodile, but that does not stop him being a symbol of liberation, as in that very same chapter, we see Emperor of the Sea and Sun God Monkey D. Luffy being put in a cage and beaten up by Nami. And I would also argue that Buggy being held by Crocodile and Mihawk goes on to show him at his most free, as it is only in this restrained state that he is able to free his heart and mind and claim his dream of wanting to become the Pirate King. So you can try to confine and restrict Buggy all you want, it's only going to increase his drive for, sweet freedom. And in a way that I don't think he'll ever come to recognize, that is, I guess coincidentally, why Mihawk has ended up joining Buggy's faction. Mihawk is a man who just wants to live without being bothered by Marines. He wants that calm freedom, and when his warlord status was revoked, apparently the greatest opportunity to pursue and regain this freedom just so happened to be with Buggy. And this might be looking into things a bit too deeply, but that's just kind of the point of talking about fictional pirates on the internet. There's even one section of Impel Down where Buggy and Mr. 3 leap into the air, with Buggy doing his own take on the Warrior of Liberation pose, which may or may not be a coincidence because Oda did have this idea in mind since Skypiea at the very least. It's not impossible, and there's also a lot of very fun irony in Buggy striking the most free pose in the world in his prison outfit. So look, as far as symbols of liberation go in this world, the mastermind of the Impel Down incident ranks pretty damn highly among them. But liberation and joy are incomplete without also being able to deliver hope, and on that note, Buggy is also one of the only other people in this world who has Luffy's special ability that was identified by Mihawk, which I love because there's a certain irony there as well of Mihawk failing to recognize that ability within Buggy, given that in the eyes of the world, Mihawk now serves under Buggy. But Buggy has that same charismatic superpower. He makes allies wherever he goes. He doesn't attract the same kind of people that Luffy does, although there is a healthy crossover, but everywhere he goes, Buggy magically and charismatically inspires people to follow him, or at the very least make friends with him. He easily made friends with Gaimon, he casually recruited Alvida, formed an instant alliance with Mr. 3, and Buggy even became drinking buddies with Ace, and if that's not good enough, he also ended up in a situation where Whitebeard, the strongest man in the world, proposed forming an alliance with him. Yes, there were other factors at play, but those other factors were all a result of Buggy being genuinely charismatic when he wants to be, and weirdly accidentally charismatic when he doesn't mean to be. He's a very non-consensual people magnet, and Jinbei has even stated that Buggy has a quote talent for leadership, which is big praise coming from him. Not to mention that his crew adore Buggy. They believe in Buggy every bit as much as the Straw Hats believe in Luffy, and this hope does even get to a deity level of worship at points, such as when it appeared that Buggy had gone and done a Moses and parted the gates of justice, which only made him a greater symbol of hope and liberation to the prisoners aboard the ship. He'd just broken them out, and now he was giving them even more freedom by parting the gates of justice. I mean, just what a guy, man. And we often look at Luffy as the luckiest and almost assisted by fate in this world, but I think there is an incredibly strong argument to be made that Buggy is actually the luckiest man alive, which also happens to be exactly how the Impel Down prisoners refer to him. And I would make that argument because Luffy works hard and often does the right thing to achieve his goals, whereas Buggy has opportunities repeatedly fall into his lap that allows him to keep up with Luffy even though he is infinitely weaker. And as far as the idea of this sun god goes, I'm not convinced that there's only one in this world, because time after time Oda shows many characters that possess the Nika iconography. The most recent of which are Loki and Colin on Elbaf, who in the same chapter were both deliberately drawn in Nika poses. So there are definitely other paths to inhabiting and expressing this power, and Buggy is well into this journey and has been ever since Orangetown, where these two cartoon gods and future cartoon emperors clashed for the very first time. Right, so here's something fun. Something that I noticed whilst going back on Buggy chapters for this video was actually in chapter 9 when Luffy is speaking to Nami about the origin of the Straw Hat. I can't even count how many times I've read these chapters, but on this occasion I noticed something that I'd never seen before. After Luffy tells Nami about his hat and about his dream, we have a reaction panel of Nami, and in the background there is a picture of a cartoon sun and moon. And slightly earlier in the conversation, there's also a different picture of a much more clear cartoon moon above the bookshelf, which is actually a bit of a manga continuity error by Oda, as a wide shot even earlier showed a completely different picture above that very same bookshelf. None of which is in the anime, by the way. In fact, in the anime, the house itself is completely different and they fill it with all sorts of generic pictures of the flowers and stuff. And this is also where that one screenshot came from of Luffy staring at Nami's butt. But knowing all of the things it is we know now, it's really really fascinating that Oda was dropping this sun and moon imagery all the way back then. And I'm not going to go so far as to say that this was all some piece of grand foreskinning by Ichiro Oda, telling us right here and now that Luffy is the sun god and also something about a moon, but it does show that this sort of imagery was very prevalent in Oda's mind right from the beginning. And in this circumstance, Buggy does quite nicely fill the role of the moon, the opposite to Luffy's sun, because he has everything in common with Luffy, but operates in the exact opposite way. Even his devil fruit was set up to be the opposite of Luffy's, with Luffy's rubber being immune to blunt force attacks but susceptible to cutting, and Buggy's fruit being immune to cutting but very vulnerable to blunt force. And both of them elect to use fighting styles that the other one is weak against, with Buggy's knives versus Luffy's fists. And you know, I didn't see it this way until Buggy became an emperor, but this clash in Orange Town was essentially the beginning of every Pokemon game. Buggy was the first devil fruit user we met aside from Luffy, so it was like a young Luffy-ling beginning his journey by selecting his starter devil fruit, and then rival Buggy selects his to be a bit of a dick and counter it, and so the two of them battle for the first time, but also continue to encounter each other at various stages of the game until we reach the top of the Pokemon League, the final battle to decide the champion, or in this case, to decide the Pirate King. Because Buggy's growth has been directly correlated with Luffy's growth, and the way that Buggy describes Luffy is as follows. It's like what a witch says: before you eat a child, you should fatten him up first. Meaning that the higher that Luffy's bounty and reputation rises, the more that Buggy will grow when he defeats him. Which I want to make very clear. That outcome where Buggy somehow defeats Luffy is not off the table. In fact, Buggy is legitimately one of Luffy's most powerful rivals. To this day, Buggy is the only person to have damaged Luffy's hat, which is a symbolic blow to Luffy's promise to Shanks and his ultimate dream. But also, Buggy almost flat out killed Luffy at Logtown. On paper, he is one of the most accomplished Luffy antagonists. Sure, Luffy can physically overwhelm Buggy and rather easily these days, but I don't think that Luffy can ever fully defeat Buggy. Just like how no one can really defeat Luffy while he's in his Gear 5th form. And also, whenever Luffy and Buggy are together, they enhance each other's comedic qualities. Oda tends to turn them into a manzai routine, which is a classic style of Japanese two-person comedy, where one person takes on the role of the bokke, the idiot, and the other is the tsukomi, the straight man. And they have a progressively more hilarious and frustrating conversation for the straight man that usually ends up in physical violence. And in this case, Buggy gets more and more frustrated with Luffy, but they enhance each other through their arguments. There aren't that many people in this world that Luffy goes, I don't like that guy, but Buggy is one of them. However, by everyone who possesses what we would describe as true power, Buggy is constantly personally disregarded. He's been called weak, he's been called nothing, he's been called a nuisance, and all of those are adjectives used by characters who even bothered to remember that Buggy exists at all. And even now, as an Emperor of the Sea, the top players of this world still completely disregard him. And that is an extremely dangerous mindset, because it shows that they do not understand the true power of the Jester, which is to influence the hearts and minds of the people. And weirdly enough, of all of the people, it is the 5 Elder Stars who have most recognized Buggy's true abilities, when after the Paramount War, they invited him to become a warlord, with Saint Shepherd Jupiter saying, "The balance of power among the pirates will be shifting soon. We must pick the ones that have the greatest influence." And that turned out to be Buggy, and he was right. And having seen what Luffy can do at his most free, I would not underestimate Buggy's role in events to come, because I can just imagine a situation where we are deep into the final war, at a point where it looks like all is lost, there is no hope, there is no liberation, there is no joy, and we're all sharing a moment of silent despair, but then a spark. Because what happens is, in that moment, Buggy farts or something, and everyone starts laughing, much to Buggy's embarrassment, but that is our cue to turn things around with that one small injection of joy. And speaking of winds blowing, Buggy has a rather pertinent line about his role in the world. Do you know which way the wind blows in this world? It's not to the east or to the west. It blows for me. And all I can say is that I continue to look forward to seeing Buggy getting blown. Vampires are real in fictional pirate world, which really shouldn't come as too much of a surprise given all of the other crap it is we've already seen, particularly in the realm of horror. We've seen ghosts, both fruit generated by Perona, as well as confirmation that human souls do exist and can act independently of a corporeal form. Zombies happen to be a thing thanks to Gecko Moria, although it's also been implied that they've existed outside of his powers as well. We also have a ton of yokai in recent One Piece, with Emu and the 5 Elder Stars, and even werewolves somewhat what exists through the Ming tribe and their Sulong transformations whenever there is a full moon. Spiritual werewolves, we'll call them. So if seemingly every other monster exists, what is the big deal with vampires, which do at least conceptually exist in One Piece, as well as much more, but we're starting here. When the crew first encounter Brook at the beginning of Thriller Bark, Usopp clads himself in a wide variety of protective materials, including a cross and garlic, which are traditionally quite effective vampire repellents. But when it's revealed that Brook doesn't have a reflection, the first response from the crew as a whole was to assume that Brook is a vampire. And vampires were pretty clearly quite a heavy inspiration for Brook's situation, as well as anyone else affected by Moria's shadow stealing abilities. They go on to lose their reflections, but also inherit the unfortunate and very vampiric weakness of bursting into flames when coming into contact with direct sunlight. So those affected by Moria gain none of the benefits of vampirism, but quite a few of the weaknesses. And Oda references vampires fairly regularly in more meta One Piece media, by which I mean something that isn't directly part of the story. The first time this happens is actually as early as chapter 14 of the series, where Luffy is drawn in a very vampiric pose, flanked by chonk bats. But my favorite example is when Oda went full vampire with Luffy on this cover of Weekly Shonen Jump, giving him funky fangs, a delicious drink of blood liquids, and an adorable chopper bat as a familiar. Even before we get to the very real vampires, vampirism leaks into One Piece a lot. Oda really likes to go back to the old blood well every few years to use them for inspiration. And most people immediately identify Dracula Mihawk as a rather spooksome character inspired by vampires, as his first appearance leaves many people questioning whether or not he flat out is a vampire. What with the eyes, the candles, the coffin vote, and just the whole vibe, you know? But the thing that gets most people is the name. And on that, I will say that in English, Mihawk's vampire inspiration is a bit overstated. A lot of people point to his name, Dracul, or Dracul, or Dracula, and figure that it's obviously inspired by that, because there is only one letter of difference. All that Oda's done here is change an A for an E, and that's what we got. That's how it's been translated in English anyway. But in Japanese, the difference is significantly more pronounced, quite literally pronounced. Dracula in Japanese would be Dorakura, whereas Mihawk's name is Jurakiru. And look, it's not the craziest difference in the world. Some of the sounds are the same, kind of, but it's nowhere near the obvious reference that it would be in English. And as a result, in the early 2000s, this difference was strong enough that fan translations were translating Mihawk's name as Jurakul or even Jurakil. But look, here is my personal speculation as to what has happened here. Eiichiro Oda is, and never has been, amazing with other languages, despite taking heavy inspiration from them and using them muchly. And this comes across when romanizing names such as Charlotte Lin Lin. When writing her name in a Roman alphabet, Oda will sometimes write it as Lin Lin and other times as Rin Rin, because the L and R sound are combined in Japanese. Oda just doesn't really care to distinguish, and so he just writes it whichever the crap way he wants at the time. Which we can also see happening with The Reverie, which Oda has since officially romanized as The Leverly. And really, anytime there's English written directly by Oda, you can count on something fun to happen, like Boa Hancock being the pirate Empress in the color spread of chapter 921, or Sanji notoriously reading a book all about cocking in chapter 1081. What I'm trying to say here is that Mihawk is pretty obviously inspired by Dracula, and what I think happened is that Oda just misspelled Dracula, or he spelt it according to how he thought it would work when Mihawk was first created, and just committed to that from then since. But the big question is, how far do Mihawk's vampire inspirations go? Do they go all the way? Well, on that, I should say that we've only ever seen Mihawk drink, never eat. Once was a glass of what was assumed to be red wine, but could also be the bloods of his victims. And another time we saw him drink what we assumed to be tea, but could also be the mulled blood of his victims. Although according to the little spat he had with Perona, Mihawk does also cook a lot, and the anime even gives us this fun filler scene of Mihawk using his title of world's greatest sous chef to chop a colossal pickle, because that is what humans eat. We've also seen Mihawk out in the sun many times, which is not classic vampiric behavior, tends to result in death. But as this video goes on, we'll see that Oda has never gone full classic vampire with any of his vampires, so this isn't necessarily a deal breaker for Mihawk, especially when he's wearing his lovely wide-brimmed sun hat. Although using a sword shaped like a cross sounds like it would hurt a lot as a vampire, as well as having that small cross around his neck. And so the only reason why vampire Mihawk isn't completely ridiculous at this stage is because of his eyes. Something is up with Mihawk's focal orbs, as the only other characters we've seen with eyes like Mihawk are Zunisha and Emu, both of whom are being beings that are effectively immortal. Zunesha was sentenced to walk the planet for all eternity, and immortal is a pretty important prerequisite for eternal punishment. Am I suggesting that we're dealing with a vampire elephant here? Maybe, but also probably not. Meanwhile, Emo appears to be at least 800 to 900 years old, and I don't think that this is just a stylistic choice by Oda. These eyes are purposely and selectively used by Oda, and something very relevant is that while Mihawk's eyes are usually yellow in the anime, in the manga, they are red and look exactly like Emu's eyes. With that said, Mihawk probably isn't a vampire. I would not bet units of currency on that. He's more like a 39-year-old dude who just never got out of his goth phase. But other characters in One Piece certainly are vampires, such as Stussy, clone of Stussy, who possesses the Bata Bata no Mi, which is exactly what it sounds like, the bat fruit, and this has from time to time been mistaken for an outright vampire fruit, as in a mythical Zoan model vampire, but it's actually a basic Zoan fruit. However, it is a fruit based on the surprisingly real vampire bats that do exist, and Stussy reflects many of their qualities, such as being the only known mammals whose nutritional needs are made up of blood from other creatures, and in the anime, Stussy also displays this funky thermal blood vision, which is something that real-life vampire bats have. They can see infrared thermal radiation. So technically, this is a carnivorous Zoan because it feeds off other creatures, and those have been noted as particularly difficult to grasp with mentally for the users, because the user of a carnivorous Zoan is subject to those intense cravings and the animalistic identity of the creature in question. So it's very possible here that Stussy has gone full vampire bat and only sustains herself off blood, or at the very least, that is her meal of choice. Kind of like Mihawk, we've only ever seen Stussy consume liquids, and there is one liquid other than blood that she drank in the past, but I honestly don't know if this was much better. During Big Mom's tea party, Stussy indulged in a glass of weird screaming giraffe, which was apparently rather tasty and smooth. However, this was arguably kind of vampiric in nature, as Smoothie was extracting the very essence and life force of her victims to create these special drinks. But what we've done here is effectively use the power of fictional fruit to create a vampire. We've taken the vampire bat creature and we have fused it with a human. And given that Stussy is a clone, she may not be unique in this endeavor. The original Miss Buckingham Stussy may also have this bat fruit, although I will say that her rather visible aging goes to show that it may not give Stussy the most desirable vampire traits, not the ones that most characters become vampires to achieve, being that good old eternal youth. For that, we'd have to find the proper vampire mythical Zoan fruit, which does exist. The Bata Bata no Mi model vampire is a proper mythical Zoan consumed by Patrick Redfield, and it predates the reveal of Stussy's basic bat fruit by almost 10 whole years. Mr. Redfield was the main antagonist of One Piece Unlimited World Red, and his devil fruit did allow access to eternal youth by draining the life force of those around him, which resulted in a rather dramatic climax featuring an old and withered Luffy. So it has nothing to do with blood sucking, but it has all the good parts of being a vampire without all of those messy mechanical bits. Of course, Patrick Redfield is extremely non-canon, but he was designed by Eiichiro Oda aesthetically, personalitically, and of course his devil fruit abilities, which would later partially be used as inspiration for Stussy's canon fruit ability. The point is, it wasn't some game designer who came up with the idea, and conceptually it is something that naturally fits into the One Piece world, and it is yet another example of Oda's fascination with vampires. And also, due to this non-canon game fruit, vampire theories did for some time enter what I call the Scopogaban tier of theory crafting, by which I mean for most of One Piece, the immediate fan response to a new unknown character being introduced was to claim that it was Scopogaban that was always the first stop, and one day that did turn out to be true, but only after 27 years of perpetually saying it. The vampire idea was quite similar. Every new character introduced with an ability tangentially related to some sort of youth was suddenly labeled as a vampire. Back during her introduction, Jewelry Bonnie was given the vampire treatment by fans who suspected that she was something of a non-traditional vampire that could both drain and restore life force without all of the messy blood suckery, which resulted in her aging effect. And the idea was that Bonnie was a being who had lived for countless centuries by absorbing the life force of those around her. I'm definitely not saying these series were good. In fact, every time the word vampire comes up, I do have to mentally brace myself for a mind crash. The most recent incarnation of this idea was actually that Emu was a vampire operating on a similar principle of sustaining himself on the energy of sourced victims for the past 800 to 900 years. And not only that, but he'd been a vampire for so long that it explains why he no longer really resembles a human. In most media, the older a vampire is, the more they evolve, or I guess devolve into something resembling more of a beast, as they slowly lose more and more of their humanity over the years. Although by far the the most interesting argument for vampire emu that I ever saw was the existence of Dracunculus vulgaris, also known as the vampire lily, with this sliver of black in the center pretty much looking exactly like emu. And vampires aside, because emus have gone far beyond that, but at this point, I do still think that this flower is very interesting and a potential strong inspiration for emu visually, just because lilies are a core part of his character. He of course has had this millennia-long obsession with Nefertari D-Lily, and within emu's private sanctuary he exclusively grows lilies, probably as a tribute to Lily herself, but just knowing about the existence of the vampire lily, emu looks right at home in this garden. And there was also the classic vampiric idea of emu granting the five elders immortality, but we now understand that that contract is far crazier and potentially far less consensual than anything that vampire emu ever brought to the table. But there was a thematic argument for emu's vampirism as well, as he saw the sun god as his enemy, a man who would bring about the dawn of the world, which sounds like quite a core threat to a vampire. And also part of this drive was to connect emu to Mihawk and explain why they have the same eyes, which is still very much a link worth exploring, just maybe not through vampires. So the thing is, I'm not sure why people go to the most extreme out there ideas when it comes to vampires, especially when we already have something so much more substantive. It just involves far less exciting characters, as we may actually have genuine non-magical fruit-based vampires in One Piece in the form of the monarchy of the Lelousia Kingdom, being King Seki and Princess Komane. Seki's name is inspired to be theorized by the Sekeli people, a Hungarian subgroup living in Romania, and notable Sekeli figures include Count Dracula, who is a Sekeli in Bram Stoker's original novel, and in addition to that, King Seki and his daughter Princess Komane favor impalement as punishment for just about every crime that could be committed, which is an obvious nod to Dracula's Vlad the Impaler heritage. But look, King Seki has vampire fangs. The dude was made to suck you off. I mean, the dude was made to suck your blood out of you. You know what? Why even try to fix it? I said what I said. But his former kingdom of Lelousia was not always a horrible place. For one thing, we did see it as quite bright and peaceful during Ace's cover story, and Oda has said that King Seki only came to power during the 2-year time skip, instantly tanking the island's well-being to the point now where it no longer exists at all. That's one of the really sad things about Lelousia. If it wasn't for King Seki coming to power and then being a prick, then no one would have needed to rebel against him. While Lelousia was a member of the world government prior to Seki's ascension, he greatly exacerbated the plight of the civilians, not only making them pay the heavenly tribute to the world nobles, but also a separate tribute to him as well. And without him, the Revolutionary Army may not have stopped there, Belo Betty wouldn't have used her powers on its people, and Lelousia would not have become Emu's target to test the ancient weapon Uranus. So he's quite the impactful character in the grand scheme of One Piece, and the anime actually expands on his history somewhat. In episode 889, there is some filler dialogue added of King Seki speaking to another monarch, whose name is Queen Lemon Cheese, from the most creatively named island in all of the One Piece world, the Best Land Kingdom. And just as the Reverie meeting is about to commence, they are making monarchish small talk, with a Lemon Cheese asking Seki how his country has been, and that she heard it was ravaged by pirates 4 years ago, with King Seki replying that thanks to Fleet Admiral Sakazuki, all of those pirates have now been sent to impel down. And at first this seems a bit jarring because, as we know, Seki only became king 2 years ago, and this Lemon Cheese is speaking to him like he was present for the last Reverie 4 years ago, like they were old friends. My guess would be that Seki did attend the last Reverie, but as a prince, much like how Vivi came to a Reverie with King Cobra, implying that the royalty of Lelousia may be a long line of vampires, or at least biologically vampire-presenting people, or the anime just forgot when they wrote this filler dialogue. The latter is probably more likely, but it doesn't matter because it can be explained away in world easily enough. But the Lelousia royalty is a lot more prominent in One Piece than most people remember, as Seki's daughter, Princess Komane, is also the person who Kobe is sent to rescue just prior to the Reverie, and it's because of her that Kobe got to meet Rebecca and Kuros from Dressrosa. And as far as the rules of vampires go, we never see Seki or Komane contradict those rules. We never see them eat, so we have no idea if they need to drink the bloods. We also don't get their opinions on garlic. We don't see them look at themselves in a mirror or see how they react to crucifixes. And something very suspicious is that in the manga, when Kobe rescues Komane, we only see her in the interior of the submarine that held her, and when Seki is at the Reverie, we only see him inside. There is only one occasion where we see these two outside, which was in Sabo's flashback retelling of what happened after the Reverie. Seki and Komane were immediately apprehended after returning to Lelousia, and they are clearly outside in this panel. However, the thing to remember about Lelousia is that at some point in the past 2 years, this kingdom developed a perpetually dark cloud cover, Cave, giving it a kind of faux night vibe and making it one of the most perfect locations in the One Piece world for any vampires that did exist to settle. And we do see our vampire monarchs once more in the dungeon before both of them are assumedly obliterated by your anus. So they do kind of meet the typical vampiric end of being reduced to dust by light, but otherwise Oda has very coincidentally or very purposely made sure that neither of them have ever been exposed to direct sunlight. It could definitely be a coincidence because that's just the curse of being a minor character. There's not enough information out there to form a solid conclusion, but if anyone in this series was a vampire without the assistance of fictional fruit, it was definitely this guy. We have some pretty incredibly big news regarding Gunko that has changed everything we thought we knew about her. And yeah, look, usually when I say that sort of thing, it's very much a YouTubery exaggeration. But on this occasion, it is frighteningly accurate. And this retcon comes to us courtesy of the newest One Piece volume, which is 112. Although I should say that at the time of this recording, the volume has yet to be actually released. However, it should be out by the time this video goes live. Either way, it doesn't really matter, because a preview of volume 112 was given featuring a segment from chapter 1137, which introduced Figolin Shamrock and Gunko, just Gunko, except it's not just Gunko anymore, as in the official volume release, extra text has been added to Gunko's introduction box, and she is now Saint Gunko of the Manmaya family. And this is a pretty incredibly big deal. Originally, Oda introduced her as just Gunko, and so it gave us the impression that she was not a world noble. So we're going to talk about why Oda changed this. I have a couple of theories because he has made very important changes like this in the past before that have resulted in pretty wide-reaching ramifications. But we're also going to answer the question of what this means for Brook, as the current implications would imply that he may have been the father of a world noble and perhaps even a world noble himself. Currently, I'm in quite a bit of doubt about that second idea, but the question does now need to be asked regardless. To clarify Gunko's new status as best we can, there is a slight difference between male and female world nobles. Just not one that we've ever really had to highlight, because there have been so few named world noble women. In fact, the only one I can think of is Saint Sharia. But in English, each world noble is referred to as a saint. So we have Saint Charlos, Saint Mosgard, Saint Shamrock, and even Saint Sharia. However, in Japanese, there is a distinction, and male world nobles are referred to as sei, as in Charlosei, with that sei kanji meaning a wide variety of things, including holy, sage, master, priest, and of course a saint. However, women are given a different title, which we first encountered with Charlos' sister Sharia, but has now been given to Gunko as well, being Gu. So she is being introduced as Gunko Gu, with the Gu being a reference to a female member of the imperial family of Japan, and can roughly be translated as a lady or highness. So there does appear to be a difference in status between male and female world nobles, or at least a difference in societal role expectations. And this is also one of the main reasons why Japanese speakers are convinced that Imu is male, because he has been referred to as Imu Sei, which fits the naming scheme of male world nobles. And as for Gunko's family name, Manmaya, we have met at least one other member of this family, which was in chapter 1096, Kuma's God Valley flashback, when the native hunting competition is about to begin. We see a series of holy knights, one of which is this woman who is determined to do well and bring glory to the Manmaya family. And whilst not exactly the same, she's also wearing a funky cap like Gunko does, which appears to be just slathered in world government logos. Big fan of the world government here. And the tempting thing to say from here is that, well, this could be Gunko's mother. However, the Gunko situation is infinitely more complicated than that. Given that we have seen a flashback of young Gunko with Brook, which must have happened before he died, that would make Gunko at the very least in her late 50s, perhaps even into her 60s, and at the extreme possibly even into her 70s. And so making her likely much older than the Manmaya woman who we saw in the God Valley flashback, but also calling something quite interesting into question. Given Gunko's age and association, would this mean that Gunko was potentially present during the God Valley incident as a member of the Holy Knights, and perhaps even partook in the recreational activity of native hunting? At the moment, moment, I don't know. But Gunko could end up giving us another very valuable piece of that sweet God Valley puzzle in the future. Other than that one mention though, the Manmayer family are one of the more enigmatic of world noble families, and in fact the only other mention of them in any One Piece media so far is season 2 of the Netflix live action series, where a promotional image of Logtown shows the Manmayer name proudly displayed on a building, which may even form part of a theater, as in another image we can see that Logtown is currently hosting a musical about the life of Garp called Hero of the Marines, the award-winning musical by Logtown Opera, described as a historically accurate musical depiction of the God Valley incident. So in the live action world, the God Valley incident is extremely well known. But back to Gunko, there is a lot more nuance to be dissected here. This was pointed out to me by Dawn and Dusk on Twitter, but the world nobles also have an established formality for referring to their parents. In the case of fathers, children use Chichiue. However, in Gunko's very brief Brook-related flashback, she uses Otosama, which indicates that she may not have originally been raised as a world noble. And if so, that gives us a couple of options. The first is that Gunko could be another case of Shanks, a biological world noble child who was taken or went missing and lived among the surface dwellers during her early childhood and was later reintroduced into world noble society. But another option would be that Gunko was adopted into the Manmayer family, and initially I'd find that less likely because the focus on purity within the world nobles is just so high that it's difficult to see them taking in a commoner and accepting her unless there is a special condition attached. For example, we know that York was supposedly going to be granted that status of a world noble, and for that to happen she would almost certainly need to be adopted into one of the existing families as well, or at the very least given a family name to use. And from what we see right now, Gunko is indeed a special case as she can become the vessel of Imu. We still don't know if she's the only Holy Knight capable of doing this, but if she is, then we have a very special case that the Manmayer family would no doubt be honored to accommodate. But before we get too deep into further implications, I want to talk about why this change was made, because what's happening right here, right now with Gunko being a member of the Manmayer family, I am convinced was not originally planned by Oda. I think he introduced Gunko with one idea of what was going to happen, and then a few weeks or even months later, he got a better idea. And to accommodate that idea, he made this change for the volume release. So this is a slightly confusing concept for anyone not hugely familiar with the manga production process, but there are differing levels of canon within the manga itself. And at the very peak of Mount Canon is the official volume release. This is designed to be the final products that we take as gospel. Meanwhile, the chapters that get released in weekly magazines are seen more as rough drafts, almost like a beta test for the real story. So what you do, right, is you expose your story to readers and they end up finding a lot of bugs and errors for you to fix in the final release. Sometimes this is painfully minor stuff, like in chapter 1120, S-Snake was accidentally drawn with Boa Hancock's dark hair, which was noticed by fans, and so in the official release of volume 110, this was corrected to give S-Snake her light hair. And one of the most minor changes I think I've ever seen comes from that same volume as well. What they did was they changed the font of Emmett's text, and I imagine that this does have quite an impact on how readers perceive Emmett, because font is such an incredibly powerful and underrated tool for conveying emotion and personality, and I do like that Oda goes to this extra effort to consider every minor detail. But because the weekly chapters are again essentially rough drafts, every now and then Oda will get a better idea for the final product of the manga, which goes on to confuse fans that read the weekly chapters and consider that to be the final product. One of the most infamous examples of this is in volume 86. In chapter 863, Jinbei explains Katakuri's devil fruit with a pretty massive difference between the magazine and volume release versions. In magazine release, Jinbei stated that Katakuri was a Logia fruit user. However, in the final volume release, his dialogue was changed and now states that Katakuri is a special paramecia, which is definitely something that still gets confused in the One Piece fanbase to this very day, because there are a lot of people who read the official chapter release that said Logia. Like, we're not talking scans here, we're talking official material. And so there's a whole legion of One Piece fans who believe that Katakuri is a Logia to no fault of their own, because Oda literally wrote it. Because there are different levels of canon. The magazine canon says Logia, however, However, it is subservient to the volume canon which says special paramecia. And my belief for why this happened is because Oda originally 100% intended for Katakuri to be a Logia user. He's the creator of the character, the writer of the series, and drawer of all the fun powers. He knew exactly what he was doing when he unambiguously wrote that Katakuri was a Logia user. It's just that after he wrote that, he came up with a better idea. Because as Oda dove further and further into the mirror match of Luffy versus Katakuri, he thought it would be more thematically appropriate for Luffy to be facing a paramecia user just like him. Except not, now that Luffy's a Zoan user, which leads us to a pretty fun scenario where between Luffy and Katakuri, they've officially been referred to as all three classes of Devil Fruit. But the reason why Oda had to make Katakuri a quote, a special paramecia is because he'd already given Katakuri's fruit properties that break the paramecia class, originally intending him to be a Logia. But look, long story less long, I believe that a similar thing has happened here with Gunko. Again, Oda is the creator of the character, the writer of the series, and he knows exactly what he's doing when he introduces two Holy Knights, identifying one of them as a world noble with a family name, and keeping the other one completely free of anything that would denote them as a world noble. It's not as if he just forgot his established in-world language for that chapter, because in that very same chapter, he uses that strict language with Shamrock, and Gunko was left blank on purpose. And whatever that purpose happened to be, it has now changed, hence the retcon for the volume release. And one generous explanation we could offer is that Oda intended for Gunko to be a world noble all along, but he couldn't decide which family she came from at the time of her magazine publication, and so he decided to kick that can into the groin of future Eiichiro Oda as a problem for him to deal with the final volume release. Because the kind of mind-boggling thing about this is that Oda wasn't trying to obscure this information from us. He wasn't hiding Gunko's family, intending to reveal her at a later date. Because if he was, he wouldn't be revealing it retroactively and rather unceremoniously through a volume release. So I think that if he knew that Gunko was a member of the Manmeyer family at the time that he originally drew this chapter, then he would have told us. So whatever happens going forward, I want to keep an open mind as to how things may have proceeded were Gunko not to have been officially named as a world noble, as that does appear to have been the original plan. And part of this could also come down to the nature of Elbaf. People are probably sick of me saying this now, but it's so true that it is always worth repeating. Oda himself stated that he wasn't originally planning on making this arc. We were going to go straight from Egghead to whatever comes next. And maybe it's just because we know, but I think it's certainly evident that Elbaf is much more improvised than a lot of other arcs that Oda had planned on making. So for what it's worth, I do think he's doing an absolutely masterful job of making Elbaf seem like an absolutely indispensable and essential addition to the series. I mean, right now we've got the Straw Hats fighting directly against Imu, so you could hardly call any of this unimportant. But when it comes to Gunko, here's a hypothesis. Oda created her as a Holy Knight, and then decided later on that she would become part of Brook's story. Sort of like how Oda created Miss Wednesday, and only after she existed did he decide to turn her into Nefertari Vivi, because he needed a princess, and look, Miss Wednesday was already there, ready, and willing to be repurposed. And then after sitting down and working out this whole Brook plot, Oda realized that he should have introduced Gunko differently. And not only that, but he has the power to do so. He can change history, which is what we now have in the volume release. But with this information, there are some denizens of the internet who have claimed that Oda has had Gunko planned ever since Thriller Bark. And this is because of a legitimately intriguing discovery that comes from episode 353. This is where Frankie digs into Brook's backstory, where Brook reveals his promise to Laboon, and as part of this story, the audience are, depending on your perspective, treated to and or tortured by extra shots of the happy Rumbar Pirates, and one of those shots features a Rumbar Pirates crew member with a tattoo that looks a hell of a lot like what we currently assume is the Mark of the Abyss, which was recently revealed on Shanks' arm in a flashback in the exact same spot as the miscellaneous Rumbar Pirates member. So obviously the tattoos, they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty shockingly similar. And so you've now got this idea floating around that this man is Gunko's father, I suppose a former Holy Knight turned musician. However, as amazingly coincidental as this is, I do feel the duty to point out that this dude is completely anime only. He does not appear in the manga, and he's inserted as a series of filler images, meaning that some character designer at Toei has coincidentally used a tattoo design that would go on to become wildly important for a future plotline involving Brook. It's a phenomenal final coincidence. And if this was actually in the manga, I'd be thinking very differently, but it is what it is. But to go back to the idea of whether or not it is possible to become a world noble from being common riffraff, I did mention the case of York before. However, there are two other notable incidents as well. The first of which is during the Reverie arc, where Stelly states his ambition to become a world noble, so he apparently believes that it is possible. And secondly, from Elbaf itself, when Gunko and Shamrock invite Loki to join the Holy Knights. Gunko states, "A member of the common rabble receiving a chance to join the ranks of gods is a miracle one can only dream of, and we are offering you that miracle now." And the way that Gunko says this is pretty highly emotionally charged, almost as if she was granted that miracle, which I think is probably the direction we're going in. From Gunko's flashback so far, I guess we have two options. Either Brooke is the father that she's calling out to, be it biological or not that, or that Gunko is crying out to her real father. And if we're going with the former, then surely Gunko has to have been adopted, because otherwise it would mean that Brooke is a world noble. Saint Manmayer Brooke, I guess we'd be calling him, especially since we've never actually heard his last name. And look, in brief defense of that idea, it was noted when this chapter came out that Brooke's sword looks a hell of a lot like the same kind of blade used by Garling and Shamrock in service of the Holy Knights. Although at the time I also argued that this could just be a generic sword design of the military that Brooke served before becoming a pirate. And just to add in a sprinkle of suspicion, going back on it, Eiichiro Oda has pretty deliberately kept Brooke separate from any world noble story threads. He wasn't even present at the human auction house when Luffy punched St. Charlos, although to be fair, he was present when Hachan made the crew promise not to antagonize the world nobles, and here he was completely silent on that matter. Otherwise, he's just been kept away from them. And so maybe the certain kingdom that Brooke was talking about serving was Marijois, and having a former world noble aboard the crew would be pretty insane. A world noble whose dream was to become a pirate. But assuming that Gunko isn't Brooke's biological daughter, the anguish on her face in this flashback may imply that her father is being killed in front of her, and thus also unlikely to be a world noble, thus supporting the Manmayer adoption idea. And with whatever this horrendous situation is, giving Brooke his exposure to the Holy Knights, which is why he knows exactly who they are to this very day. But that's also a bit difficult to reconcile, because throughout this video I've used the term adoption to refer to Gunko, but with what we know I think kidnapping might seem more accurate, and I have a very hard time seeing Brooke just vanishing to pursue his piratesome dreams if he knew that Gunko was suffering or in danger. So there's a lot of questions to be answered by Mr. Storyman Eiichiro Oda here, but at the very least we do know that he does have a plan, because he very sneakily snuck up behind us and is now attempting to gaslight One Piece readers into believing that Gunko was a named world noble all along. So look, sure, I'll play along. Let's pretend that none of this ever happened. And I very much look forward to seeing where this effort takes us. The ending of One Piece has allegedly been leaked, and not recently either, but all the way back in 2015, but no one took it seriously because it spoke about Luffy and his allies fighting the devil in some sort of huge war that would engulf the world. Ridiculous, right? But it is now 2025, and with everything that's happened, we need to examine this leak with a lot more seriousness than we did in 2015. And as our internet tale goes, on Thursday the 5th of March 2015, a user named Japanation Animanga made a post on 4chan, specifically the anime and manga board, and this post claimed to leak at the end of One Piece, and despite the fact that this anonymous post had not a lot to back itself up in terms of credibility, it ended up being reported on by a number of news websites such as K-Drama Stars. And after it became official news, it then spread to Reddit and all across all of the internets like a disease. I genuinely don't know how this post picked up so much traction, but even I remember seeing this, and I wasn't really heavily involved in the online One Piece community at the time either. But this ending contained spoilers for 7 major plot points, and 10 years later, as ridiculous as they sounded at the time, a number of these plot points have turned out to be true, and many others are seriously building towards a state of truth. Let's start by clearing up a common misconception, because one of the primary replies to this leak 10 years ago was, no one knows the ending to One Piece except Oda and his editor, maybe his wife if she's lucky. So look, the ending of One Piece is often treated like this closely guarded national secret locked away only in the mind vault of Eiichiro Oda, but it's not. The ending isn't something available to the public, of course, but as the commenter mentioned, Oda's editor also knows the ending of the series. However, what that commenter fails to consider is that at the time of recording this video, Oda has had 14 different editors since One Piece began, and each and every one of them know the ending. So the very first thing that happens after someone is hired as an editor is allegedly a phone call with Eiichiro Oda where he tells them everything. Primarily what the One Piece is and how the series is going to end, just so that every editor knows what it is they're working towards. And very curiously, even though they all get the same information, different editors have had different interpretations of this ending. And there was once an interview with two of Oda's editors where one said that the One Piece treasure itself is impossible to explain in a single word, whilst the other one vehemently disagreed. Although this could just be tag teaming contradictions to keep readers and watchers off the scent. The one thing that all 14 editors have been in complete agreement upon is that this ending is pretty spectacular. And of course, they are sworn to secrecy. To the point where there's even one editor whose girlfriend broke up with him because he wouldn't tell her the ending of the series, which I must say, absolute Chad behavior, good sir. But that's already 14 more people who know the ending. And not all 14 of them may have had the same mental fortitude as that guy. As the old quote says, 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Because the more people you tell, the more points of compromise you have. And within the manga and anime industry, there is an untold amount of people who know the ending of One Piece, including Goro Taniguchi, who directed the very first One Piece animation project, which was an OVA, called One Piece Defeat the Pirate Ganzak, which I have here on video cassette. That's how old it is, and that's how old I am that I know what this is. Goro Taniguchi also directed Film Red, and according to Oda in an interview for Film Red, he told Taniguchi the ending of One Piece all the way back when that first OVA was being made in the 90s. And Taniguchi at the time had just been sitting on that information for about 25 years, more like 28 years now. So a lot of industry insiders who have had a major role in a One Piece project are likely to know the ending as well. And in addition to that, in 2014, Oda reportedly also told the ending to a terminally ill child as part of the Japanese equivalent of the Make-A-Wish Foundation, which was reported in an article titled One Piece Ending Revealed by Eiichiro Oda to Child Suffering from Cancer. Oda holds back tears as he reveals huge spoilers about how One Piece ends. And we're going to keep that story in mind because weirdly enough, we're going to have to come back to it later. It ties quite closely into the nature of the leaked ending itself. But let me set the stage for this leak by taking your mind back to 2015. On the day the leak was posted, the latest chapter of One Piece to come out was chapter 778, Tactics number 5, which is where Zoro defeats Pika after being thrown like a bowling ball. This is Dressrosa era stuff, and even though we're almost 800 chapters into One Piece, somehow we still have no idea where it's going. We haven't met Imu, we don't know the truth of Luffy's Devil Fruit, we haven't met Zunisha, Emmett, or any of Joy Boy's former comrades. In fact, Joy Boy himself is nothing but a name. We heard that one time on Fishman Island, and we don't even know that the road poneglyphs exist, and that's how we actually find Laugh Tale. We were still so shockingly naive to the world, its history, and secrets. And with that in mind, this leaked ending appeared online mere days after chapter 778 was released, as Jap Nation Animanga posted the following. A guy named Junichiro Fumi, a guy at Shueisha who helps Oda draw the panels of One Piece, said there would be a huge war against the Devil and his army versus Luffy and his army of pirates. Fumi said that the Devil and his army have access to all of the powers that could be given by Devil Fruits. Luffy is already the pirate king at this point because he has united the pirates and the marines, and yes, the D's are descendants of the Devil that they are fighting. That is the leak, and there is no one on this planet who could have taken that seriously at the time. But over the last 10 years, whether this leak was real or not, and we will get into examining how likely it was to be real in a bit, doesn't matter. Either way, it's still kind of happening. Of course, the most immediate and most ball-grabbing element of the leak is the mention of the Devil, which as of chapter 1150, it does appear that Imu, a character who hadn't even been introduced at the time of the leak, has a very stereotypically devilly design and demony abilities. Although to some degree the idea of a devil has been present in One Piece ever since chapter 1. Devil fruits were said to be enchanted by the sea devil and are so loathed by the sea itself that it curses the users and takes away their ability to swim him in it. And within the One Piece world, there's also been an ongoing superstition that fruits each contain the spirit of a devil, which possesses the body of whoever consumes the fruit, something which has also gone on to become weirdly true in the case of Zoan fruit specifically. But even with that, the idea of Luffy facing off against a literal devil was way too ridiculous to consider in 2015. But now, it's pretty hard to deny that this is exactly where we're going. Or at the very least, it's exactly where we've already been, because the Elbaf mural flat out shows Luffy, Nika, Joy Boy, whoever it is, leaping into battle combat with a shadowy demon devil, backed by all of the allies we've made throughout the series. In the mural, we see minks, fishmen, samurai, giants, Lunarians, Tontada, and even a ship with the flag of Alabaster clashing against the devil and his forces of evil. Although something we have yet to see at the time of this recording is Imu and his Legion of Darkness having access to all devil fruit abilities. However, that is something that has also been slowly coming true through Dr. Vegapunk, whose research has now discovered the power to mimic all Paramecia and Zoan devil fruit abilities, and all of that research exists within the mind of York, who has now pledged her allegiance to the world government. So even if it's not an Imu specific ability, we are still very much building a reality where the world government can use most, and maybe even one day, all devil fruit powers. And another big thing that the leak gets correct is the concept of one big final war in One Piece, which is potentially starting right now as we speak. And as mentioned before, this war is depicted in the Elbaf mural. The first time that we heard tell of this final war was from the journal of Kozuki Oden, and also in his letter to Toki. Over 20 years ahead of us, there will likely be a massive war terrible enough to split the seas themselves. In other words, in another 20 years, the primary figures of this great war will muscle their way into the new world. So it looks like the leak got that right as well. However, it would be a bit disingenuous to give the leak too much credit for this, because as much as we didn't confirm it until Wano, Eiichiro Oda himself actually spoiled this plot point years ago. In the year 2012, Eiichiro Oda said, "One thing that motivates me to keep drawing is that I want to draw the final saga. The final saga will be so amazing that it makes the Marine for Dark look like nothing. The Marine for Dark was just a side trip to me. I didn't expect it to be so popular." So as much as it's, it's definitely happening, I'm not sure how much credit we can give to the leak for the idea of there being a huge final war, because we already knew that 3 years before this leak happened. But one of the most interesting parts of the leak is the idea that Luffy will already be the Pirate King by the time that the final war begins, which is very possible, especially since we now know that becoming the Pirate King isn't the end game for Luffy. That's just what he views as a prerequisite to achieve his true and currently unknown dream. Although at the moment it does feel more likely that the final war will be entwined with the fight for Pirate King, a struggle between our 4 leading candidates, Luffy, Shanks, Blackbeard, and the magnificent Buggy. And I do think it would be amazing to see even a brief era where Luffy is considered to be the Pirate King, rather than win the final war, Luffy becomes the Pirate King, does dream, and the end. But another massive chunk of this leak has to do with the idea that Luffy has managed to unite the pirates and the Marines. This is something that felt especially absurd in 2015, because if he were to do that, then there wouldn't really be anyone to fight against, or at least at the time, we didn't know there were others. However, we've recently discovered that the World Nobles have a force of their own in the Holy Knights, and Imu can even create his own army of demon folk, and after seeing that, the Marines may very well flip and align with Luffy due to the more existential threat in play. I, for one, find it very difficult to believe that Sakazuki would continue to serve the world government if he was to learn about Imu. It just doesn't seem like it fits with his definition of justice. And at the very least, we are likely to see something of a Marine civil war, with the sword-affiliated Marines pursuing their own justice as they're allowed to do so, in contrast to whatever Sakazuki has in store for his absolute loyalists. And in any case, I do think that a union of pirates and Marines is what we're heading towards, with Luffy and Kobe as the respective figureheads. But then, of course, there's the most insane part of the leak, which is the claim that everyone with the Will of D is a descendant of the devil being fought against. All of our Luffys, our Rogers, our Solstices, they're all from Imu, implying that every D is biologically related to this D evil, or maybe even the original devil before him. And at this point, this is actually the only part of the leak that I do still have trouble getting behind. It could be the case, and maybe there's been a historical issue with Imu being able to control those with the Will of D as a result, but this is where the leak loses me a bit, and I have to remind myself about just how reliable this information really is, because there is no doubt that this was an incredible incredibly stunning prediction for 2015. It is mostly aged like fine wine. However, there is a big however, as the thing that gives this leak the most credibility, other than the fact that it is starting to sound like what's happening in the manga right now, is that Jap Nation Animanga went and dropped a real human named Junichiro Fumi. So it wasn't just citing an anonymous source. And it was alleged that this Junichiro Fumi was an assistant on One Piece, but unfortunately this is extremely difficult to verify. To the best of my knowledge, manga assistants aren't credited in the published volumes, at least not for One Piece. Some manga series do credit assistants, but it might just be a Shueisha policy not to. I feel like that might make the assistants easier to control, because if you've got your name attached to something like One Piece, then it might be easier to get a job with another publisher. But if you've got no public identity whatsoever, then you've also got no artistic footprint to show for yourself. Alternatively, it could also be to preserve the integrity and the image of the author, like how we have this whole cult of Goda that has developed over the course of One Piece. And look, the dude does work extremely harder than most of the planet, only sleeping 3 hours a day and everything. But if we also had a list of like 10 credited assistants, then it might break the illusion a bit. Although it's not like they're a secret. The last time Oda commented on it, I believe he said he had about 5 assistants, and he does sometimes talk about them in SBS segments, but he always uses pseudonyms. He never uses their real names, which brings us back to the assistant in question. After consulting with Arta from the Library of Ohara, he's also pointed out to me that Fumi is all but unheard of as a family name in Japan, with the exception of one specific region. And even if you do have the powers of Japanese, there is no online evidence available to prove whether or not this person even exists. And so it becomes quite likely that this is a made-up name from someone not intimately familiar with Japanese culture. To be clear, it's not impossible for someone to be named Junichiro Fumi, but I would say that it is extremely unlikely given what I have to tell you next. If you recall the story I told earlier about the terminally ill child who Oda allegedly told the ending of One Piece to, well, that story was also first reported on K-Drama Stars, the same website that first published the leaked ending. And their source to the terminally ill child story just so happened to be our old mate Jap Nation Animanga. And this is where things actually get a bit weird and off-putting, because this article didn't just mention some anonymous child. The child themselves was named, full name and everything. It was reported that a child called Hinati Fujinami had been given a diagnosis of lung cancer, and if you even have a beginner's grasp of Japanese, you will have already realized that there is a big problem there. Because Hinati is a name that cannot exist in the Japanese language. Hinati. That T sound at the end doesn't exist in Japanese. You can have ta, you can have to, you could have su, you could even have te if you wanted to, but there is no T. Now, to be fair, it could just be a misspelling by the guy who wrote the article, whose name is Gunther Barbosa, which also sounds fake as crap. We'll get to that. But the name is mentioned multiple times, and it is always spelled as Hinati. And in addition to that, according to Arta, there is absolutely no record of either of these stories in the Japanese-speaking community. It's only English speakers and some Europeans who have pounced on this, who know about this alleged leak and the terminally ill child stuff. And given that both of these stories supposedly originate from Japan, there is no way that either of them would have gone unnoticed. So if I may, I'd like to make an accusation here. And what I'm going to do, right, is I'm going to j'accuse the crap out of Jap Nation Animanga for making all of this up. And to get a bit conspiratorial, I'd also suspect that he was involved in the K-Drama Stars news website, given that they are always the ones who so diligently published his stories, with both articles, the leak and the child with cancer, having been written by the same author, Gunther Barbosa. And who knows, maybe Gunther Barbosa and Jap Nation Animanga are actually the same person, and he was making up sources for his own stories. And you know what? Usually that wouldn't bother me. The ending leak is whatever. It's the internet. You can never expect honesty. But even then, making up the story about the kid with the cancer is still a pretty dick move. But putting that to one side, even though this 10-year-old leak is 99.9 so many 9% complete and utter bullshit, it is still a matter of interest just how accurate it's becoming over time. And at this stage, Jap Nation Animanga, if that is indeed your real name, you may end up being the one person on this planet who correctly called the ending of One Piece. And he did so whilst trying to make up the most ridiculous conclusion possible to troll people. And we couldn't have known this at the time, but going with the most ridiculous possible option just so happens to be Eiichiro Oda's preferred path as well. Why is Shank called a rat? What is this meme? I don't understand it. I need someone to explain it to me. So the answer to that question is surprisingly complicated, because Shanks is a fictional pirate who has been put on public trial now for the last 28 years of real-world publishing time, and it's only in the last few months that this trial has concluded. And you might think that you know this story, but mate, this goes all of the way back to 1997, and according to my YouTube statistics, almost 30% of you watching weren't even born back then. So let me tell you the story of the oldest theory and the oldest accusation in One Piece. When One Piece first began, mangaka Eiichiro Oda was a lot more brutal and, how shall we say, morally grey than what he evolved into in the present day. And in fact, in chapter 1, he goes to some pretty great lengths to ensure that our protagonists are not seen as typical good guys, or even, depending on your perspective, good guys at all. Particularly with Ben Beckman's famous line, "You're not dealing with saints here. We're pirates and we don't play by the rules," which came right after Lucky Roo shot and killed a bandit in the head, which immediately sets a stage worthy of a piratesome story. And Shanks isn't portrayed as your standard good guy shonen mentor, as even the glare of Conqueror's Haki at the Lord of the Coast shows that Shanks has a much harsher side to him, yes. So whilst chapter 1 did give us an overall very warm impression of Shanks, the commentary on pirate-based morality is something that stayed with the fanbase. Now, unfortunately, we have no record of what discussion was like at the time, because the internet did not exist when chapter 1 was published in 1997. I mean, yes, it did exist, but it was more of a novelty. A better comparison might be that Google didn't even exist in 1997. Google, the company that owns YouTube, the thing it is that you're watching and pays me every month. One Piece is older than Google. But ever since I first started reading the One Piece in the mid-2000s, one theory has consistently popped up, which is that Goldie Roger didn't miraculously develop some incurable condition, and he was in fact poisoned, almost turning a lot of the first decade of One Piece discussion into something of a murder mystery. There were all kinds of fun suspects. Buggy was one to call on due to him being an established antagonist, and before we met Dark King, Silver's Rayleigh, the first mate, was also put forward as a potential murderer, as well as the even more unknown at the time Scopogaban. But there was one character who took more focus than any other, and that was Mr. Shanks. And this Shanks poison theory can be summed up by the following Reddit post. "I wouldn't be surprised if he poisoned Roger. That's why he's sick. He's a f***ing rat. Maybe he also poisoned Luffy's orange juice. I mean, he did poison his mind to be a pirate instead of a good marine." In the beginning, this idea had no evidence whatsoever, and as a result was mostly dismissed, as it should be. However, there would go on to be a few key moments in One Piece where this idea looked not totally entirely ridiculous. And of the more recent of those points, this theory did pick up a mild amount of steam after J. Garcia Saturn was revealed to be the warrior god of science and defense and had a hobby of creating diseases in his spare time. The idea here being that Saturn created a one-of-a-kind condition for Roger to be afflicted with, and he used Shanks to deliver it. And from here, men on the internet did what men on the internet do to a roughly adequate standard, which was to scour the entire One Piece manga for evidence of this, and a very, very disturbing trend was discovered. A trend of Shanks offering people drinks. Poisoned drinks. In chapter 1, Shanks tried to poison Higama the bear by giving him the only bottle in Makino's bar that was left conveniently unconsumed, likely because of all of the poison inside of it. And following the Eni Slobby incident, Shanks decided to meet Whitebeard personally, bringing with him his greatest of weapons, a giant bottle of poison that Shanks claims is a, quote, wine from my hometown. And when Ace set out to sea on his ground adventure, he made a special detour to thank Shanks for saving Luffy's life, and this is the infamous scene where there is a continuity error as Shanks has apparently regrown his left arm. That is what Shanks wants you to think. He wanted you to focus on the left arm that shouldn't be there to distract you from the right arm, holding a big old cup of poison that Ace proceeds to drink. And look, this could all be coincidence, but Higama, dead. Whitebeard, dead. And Ace, oh, very dead. So even if Shanks wasn't using poison, there could be a Sanji lighter curse at play here, which, if you don't know, anyone who ends up lighting a cigarette for Sanji ends up dying, which would be Pedro and also Ace. Oh, you got double cursed. So you just remember smoking kills, but in the One Piece universe, it kills everyone except for the smoker themselves. And that's not all, because according to Drink Theory, Shanks is currently working on 2 more victims. As in chapter 96, Mihawk brings learns news of Luffy's first bounty, and what does Shanks do? He forces Mihawk to have a drink. And following the raid on Onigashima, Shanks graciously hosts Marco and pumps him full of cursed liquids as well. Both of them, according to drink theory, will be dead by the end of One Piece, which is, it might be possible. But not just them, no, another one. Oddly enough, as recently as chapter 1126, Oda has created a minor chemical reaction within the mind-brains of poison proponents, where the red hair pirates arrive to deliver scarlet justice to the Bato Club. And what is this? Ship Dr. Hongo, what are you doing with a vial of poison? And why were you ordering Bartolomeo to feed it to Luffy? Could this be the fabled poison that Shanks used to take the life of Roger, slowly mixing it into his daily rations of sake and Higashi's a mistake? Probably not, because the poison didn't have any effect on Bartolomeo. It was just used as a test to see how loyal he was to Luffy. Or was it? Because here is the thing, right? Bato did get poisoned. It's a slow-acting poison. The same poison Shanks has been feeding Roger as a kid, and the same poison that rat gave to Whitebeard. Bato got hit with the Deadbeat Devastator, which refers to Yasopp destroying his ship because he's a deadbeat dad, because he was gonna get ill and know too much. Little does Shank know that Bato has a barrier bubbled and escaped alive. He's gonna make his way to Luffy, dying slowly in the process and revealing the truth. Them sinking Bato makes no sense. This has to be some arbitrary plot device. So that was the main thought that spawned from this chapter, and the top response to that thought was, he also gave the poison to Goku so the future androids can kill everyone, which is a good summary of how seriously this idea was taken. Not very. But the point is that Shanks' suspicion has been around since literally day one, and also day whatever this one is. And in fact, this evil Shanks may indeed be the oldest theory in all of One Piece. And as the series went on, fans were always actively looking for the next sinister scrap of evidence to prove it. And one such scrap was found during Water 7 when Monkey D. Patriarch said to Luffy, "Do you even have the slightest idea what kind of pirate your redhead friend is?" Which are words not so easily dismissed. Yes, Garp has a vendetta against Shanks for corrupting his grandson, but he generally has quite a finely tuned moral compass. And here Garp is hinting that there is a side of Shanks that Luffy hasn't seen. Because that's not the kind of thing that I could see Garp saying about Roger, who Garp greatly respected. Then came Shanks intercepting Kaido in the New World before he could get to Marineford, preventing Kaido from joining the fight, which would have led to the complete destruction of the world government. At any point in history, the world government have never had enough power to take on two emperors at once, which, as expected, has led to the accusation that Shanks was a world government agent, and he had been sent specifically to block Kaido so that the world government could safely deal with Whitebeard. Although the reality was probably the exact opposite. Shanks stopped Kaido to help Whitebeard because Kaido wanted to kill Whitebeard, not attack the world government. But look, facts have never been a force powerful enough to stop this here theory as we continue. As Shanks then took a rather long break from One Piece, 248 chapters to be precise, and in fact, this is absolutely wild, but Shanks' first post-time skip appearance in the manga was during Whole Cake Island in the From the Decks of the World cover story. He was gone for 6 whole years, and we see him so much now in the modern day that we don't really appreciate just how long he was gone for. But that absence did not stop him from being accused of nefarious deeds. In fact, his continuous absence only further fueled the flames of suspicion. During Fishman Island, Madame Charlie made the infamous prediction that Luffy would destroy said Fishman Island, and very, very importantly, in the manga, Luffy's face is never shown with this prediction. It's just a silhouette of a man wearing a straw hat, and knowing that our protagonist would never do such an evil with all of the fire and everything, the thought became that this could be, in fact, Shanks, and that after Luffy returned the straw hat, Shanks would finally come out of the closet as evil and destroy Fishman Island. I wouldn't go so far as to call this a good theory, even at the time, and in fact, for much of its lifespan, the evidence for this idea has been pretty flimsy at best. And almost every iteration of the evil Shanks idea can be summed up by a Reddit post made 7 years ago now that starts with, "Yo guys, I recently came up with the idea of Shanks being the one who diseased Gold Roger when he was, quote, just a cabin boy. I don't know, it came up my head. Share what you think about this." I think not good things if it came up your head, but there's also this other thread which opens the evil Shanks theory with, "I don't have much to say, it's mostly that I love the concept of it." That is exactly what sustained evil Shanks for more than 2 decades. The idea that it it might be cool, maybe. That and the odd panel of Shanks looking rather ominous, like this one from chapter 903, where he says he'll be meeting Luffy soon, whilst admittedly looking a little bit like a serial killer. But laugh all you want at these brave theorists on the internet, but at one point in time, things did get quite serious for Evil Shanks, and it was only a handful of chapters after that panel. Up until this point, every Evil Shanks theory boiled down to maybe it's true, and if so, I would like that. But seeing a Shanks-like figure meeting the Five Elder Stars in chapter 907 changed everything, and it turned even the most hearty of Shanks supporters into questioning of his intentions. The Elder Stars being so casual with Shanks was always so incredibly suspicious due to the fact that he was one of the major enemies of the world government. He was a Yonko, a Four Emperor. I mean, just imagine if any other Emperor of the Sea had strolled into this room. Big Mom, Kaido, Blackbeard, Whitebeard? Are the Five Elders just going to continue doodling penises on their paperwork if they walk in? Probably not, especially Whitebeard. He's meant to be dead. They're more likely to make unfortunate use of their drizzling incontinence before commencing a fight battle that has the potential to destroy all of Marijois. So knowing only what we knew back then, it was so hard to justify why Shanks was here and why the Five Elders were so comfortable with him and so dismissive of him. And so the conclusion was that Shanks could be working as a spy for the world government, whose mission was to something be a bit of a dick? I don't know. I heard it suggested a lot back in the day that he was a plant emperor, and I don't mean that like plant Admiral Ryokugyu. I mean that Shanks was intentionally elevated to that position in order to carry out strategic operations on behalf of the world government. Stuff like delaying Kaido and also magically showing up as soon as Blackbeard and the Impel Down prisoners rocked up, as well as being so civil with Sengoku negotiating the end of the war, many suspicions were had. Of course, other explanations were available, such as Shanks having been a former world noble who is still firmly good, but using his past connections to try and keep the world together just long enough for Luffy to become the Pirate King. But none of those explanations were anywhere near as exciting as the story equation that man with unknown motive plus man with connection to the world government equals very, very bad man. And to be fair to the equations, that maths wasn't wrong. It was just wrong to apply it to Shanks instead of Shamrock. But from this point on, it became headcanon in certain online circles that Shanks was acting as an informant to the Five Elders, a snitch, nay, a rat. And that idea was kept alive with the power of memes, probably the most iconic of which is the squeak panel, although I'm personally a big fan of any variation of I'm telling the Gorosei. But Shanks doing Odin's naked dance in the Room of Authority also got me good, and there were also quite a few depictions of Shanks' mythical rat Zoanfruit during Eckhead Island. In addition to the Five Elders, apparently we also got to see Shanks transform into a giant rat yokai. Not that that could ever reach the sheer dramatic lows of Shanks tearfully claiming, "I still have the Gorosei," nor the dramatic heights of "he snitched." Although in the hugest of twists, it turns out that Shanks was even present in Sanji's second flashback, snitching on Sanji to his father, Vinsmoke Judge. And Shanks even started to make guest appearances in other manga series like Jujutsu Kaisen. And don't forget the worldwide release of One Piece film Rat, or that time that Shanks came in Luffy's hat. From the moment that chapter 907 came out, Shanks became a bigger villain in the One Piece fanbase than most actual villains. And the Rat Shanks memes became even more prevalent than the Fraud Hawk memes, my favorite of which is this fan art of Mihawk painting his sword black because he doesn't have the skills to create a real black blade. But look, what chance did Fraud Hawk ever have, because you can't ignore the rat. And the end of Wano certainly did not help his case either, because right at the conclusion of that arc, we saw Shanks saying that it was time to find the One Piece, which conflicts somewhat with the goals of our protagonist, who needs to find the One Piece to become the Pirate King and then to do whatever his ultimate dream is. So this is the first actual case we have of Shanks actively standing in the way of Luffy, or at least appearing to. It looks like Evil Shanks or not, they are going to be sort of rivals in the final saga. But if you were a fan of Evil Shanks, then this could be taken as a pretty nefarious move, as if he'd almost spent the past 2 decades since Roger's death meticulously planning for this one moment that would allow him to claim the One Piece, potentially even knowing that this was the year when it can actually be used. Shanks was being treated as some sort of Blackbeard, a man who has actually been meticulously planning and plotting for decades. But the fact is that we are now over 1,000 100 chapters into the series and we still have no idea what Shanks' goal even is, regardless of whether he's evil or whether he's not that. This was the height of Evil Shanks allegations. The circumstantial evidence was starting to swing heavily against him, and what it would take to stop a guilty verdict in the court of public opinion was the calling of a surprise witness. As on Elbaf, we were introduced to Shanks' twin brother Shamrock, and all of a sudden almost everything made sense, because at the very least chapter 907 now made sense, as that is almost certainly Shamrock in the room of authority with the five elders, not Shanks, and that was the main piece of substantive evidence against Shanks. And this was the perfect solution to that question, because fans now got the best of both worlds. For everyone who'd believed in Shanks all along, yes, he was a good man with probably good intentions, and for everyone who believed in Evil Shanks or Rat Shanks, we get one of those as well. Echiro Oda was feeling extra generous and bought in extra Shanks at the Shanks store for us to explore all of the ideas that Evil Shanks brought to the table. And as a result, in the fan base, none of these ideas have completely gone away. It's just that the heat has now shifted to Shamrock. In a thread titled Random Shanks Theory I Just Came Up With Cause I'm High, an alternate explanation was offered for the Roger Poison theory, stating, is this even the real Shanks? Just think about it. After the reveal of the God Knights with Garling and there being a possible cousin/brother around his age, brackets El Hermano, it gave me the sudden idea that our rat boy Shanks has a twin. But not just any twin, because the original Shanks was found by Roger. And if that Shanks has a twin that is trained to be a skilled fighter/hockeyman by Papa Garling and serving Emu to stop possible Joy Boy reincarnations from clapping Lily's cheeks once again. Oh, I forgot he wrote that. Then I am convinced that the Shanks that cried to Roger was not the Shanks Roger found, but a twin sent by the Gorosei Emu to replace the original Shanks and poison assassinate Roger. So interestingly enough, this thread actually predates the revelation of Shamrock, so it was pretty smack bang on with the twin idea. You've got to give this wildly high Redditor that much credit, but this idea now gets infinitely more complicated by stating that at some point Child Shanks was swapped with Child Shamrock, who impersonated Shanks and poisoned Roger, resulting in his incurable condition. Yes, it is far-fetched, yes, it is ridiculous, and yes, it is smack bang in the same sort of absurd spirit that Rat Shanks theory has always inhabited. So now I would just like to offer my congratulations to Mr. Shanks for being exonerated after 28 years of intense suspicion. It's been a very long and very public trial, but I'm glad that this case is finally closed. Emu is actually a force for good, trying to prevent the Great War. In Emu's mind, war is the worst, so they would do anything to prevent it. However, Emu is most pure of heart, Uno reverse with her powers. Emu will be on Luffy's side to fight Blackbeard. So mate, that is quite the prediction. And I do think that this would be a pretty tough ask. However, this chapter does have one little secret that has been hidden from us English-speaking swine, which is that St. Summers and St. Gillingham refer to Emu with a very special title known as Ontai, which I'd never even heard of before this chapter came out, but it gets used in relation to someone so mighty and distant that you can't help but feel respect for, but also someone close enough that there's an affection as well, which sounds quite religious to me. Like the love that you would have for your god combined with that respect, admiration, and of course distance, because you're you and the god is God. But it was used historically for particularly impactful figures like Nobunaga Oda. And I should say that Viz has chosen to translate this as Great One, which from what I've been told doesn't quite nail the nuance of it. It's not their fault, we just don't really have a title that does. But it's a surprisingly warm title used with a sense of familiarity. And I suppose the implication is that Summers and Killingham do have that warmth towards Emu, and it's not just a cold, subservient relationship, which definitely adds a new layer to Emu and the whole operation that I've never previously considered. But this idea also goes back to the reason why it was said that 20 kingdoms formed an alliance in the first place. It was because they were concerned about that one ancient kingdom, all of their technologies, and particularly after it went and invented 3 ancient weapons. And perhaps like many of Vegapunk's creations, these were never intended to be weapons, but you can't blame the rest of the world for looking at them and going, nah mate, I should probably do something about that. And to Emu's credit, as far as we know, he has kept the world in a state of mostly peace for the last 800 years. I use the word mostly there very generously. It would be more accurate to say that he's kept the world government affiliated nations in a state of peace, whilst every other nation has been subject to a wide array of ever-expanding and disturbingly creative atrocities. And right there lies my main issue with Emu being this sort of misunderstood force of good. One Piece does have quite the habit of rehabilitating former antagonists, to the point where it's actually significantly rarer for an antagonist to remain a bad dude, such as the case of Rob Lucci, who did indeed do that. But with every villain who undergoes the shift from bad to not as bad, there has to be some plausibility to it. Such as recently with Ulti and Page 1. They can kind of get away with being good guys now because they were just kids with tragic backstories who were indoctrinated into the cult of Kaido. And very importantly, we never saw either of them do anything particularly evil or unforgivable. The worst thing that happened was that Ulti smacked Tama, which was bad, but I don't know. It is implied that as members of the Toby Roppo, they did worse things off screen, but we never saw any of it, so it doesn't really matter because it's not in our minds as readers. However, with Emu, what we saw very much on screen was him ordering the deaths of every living being on the Lucia, and unless what he did was magically transport everyone to a pocket dimension to live happily ever after with infinite food and puppies, that is going to be a pretty tough act to come back from. However, Emu could very much see himself as the hero here, the good guy doing everything he can to prevent the prophesized Great War from literally ending the world. Because according to the Harley text, we are moving on to the next one soon. And Emu really could be the flip side of the sun god Nika, the destroyer to Luffy's liberator, or even a previous Nika carnation who was responsible for enacting the destruction of the previous world. But another thing I have difficulty with is the sheer cruelty that has taken place under Emu's rule. And we have countless, but we only need one example, which is Saint Saturn's experimentation on Ginny. But that stuff happens on the Holy Land day after day after day, and it is so hard to see someone who propagates the world noble system considering themselves in any way good. But even then, putting that to one side, there are a lot of factions here, and it's not out of the question for Blackbeard to become a problem so massive that the world government and the Straw Hats do end up being temporarily allies to take him down, because that is exactly what happened with Rocksteady's Zebek on God Valley. But it could also work out to be another scenario where Luffy and Blackbeard end up reluctantly working together, like during the Impel Down incident, or there is indeed the worst case scenario, which I've speculated on before, which is that Blackbeard offers an alliance with the world government, and we have an impossibly uphill battle to fight. What if the ability to turn into demons is similar to the drugs Hody had in Gishman Island? So the drugs are quite similar in many ways. And what we're talking about are the energy steroids that Hody just guzzled from the tomato box. These funky little pills were so old that no one really knows where they came from, who made them, or any of the other question words. And when the new Fishman pirates took them, their muscle mass increased, making them bigger. And in the case of Hody, who OD'd on them, it changed his appearance completely. It even gave him some rather demonic spikes on his wrists. But the pills, this is important, they also had healing properties. After Hody got sliced up by Zoro, he was in pain, so much pains, and so he took far too many energy steroids in order to heal himself. So there is an argument here that the regeneration effect is present in these pills on an incredibly small scale. And very importantly, the energy steroids also distorted the minds of the new Fishman pirates. After taking the pills, they became noticeably more aggressive and, dare I say, demonic, just like the giants have become here after being Domi-reversied. And also, the energy steroids come at the cost of lifespan. And after heavily abusing them, all of the new Fishman pirates ended up as shriveled old men. So I think there is a very strong case to be made that these energy steroids are potentially linked to Emu. Because these pills probably date back to the Void Century at the very least, and I can imagine them being a gift from Emu, a sinister gift, with some of his powers imbued into them, with the intention of turning Fishman Island against itself. But luckily the pills were never taken, or if they were, it was quickly discovered and the rest was sealed away in this box. And they were labeled the national treasure of Fishman Island to make sure that this evil never touched anyone else. And just as a side note on this topic, in One Piece Party, one of the many spin-off manga series, these do also exist in the form of the energy steroid Dango. And what they do is inflate their consumers into big old balloons, kind of like Gecko Moria after eating one too many shadows, which I love. One Piece Party is so good, and I really wish there was an official translation. Could Gunko be special because someone did the immortality surgery? Law's fruit fruit, that would be the perfect vessel for Emu, as it just can't die. I mean, we're still very early days with this whole vessel stuff, but also this discussion gets a bit dangerous because we're now risking conflating misconceptions. Law's devil fruit is said to be able to grant perpetual youth, which is not immortality. The person granted this youth can still die. It's kind of like the opposite of what we're seeing with the Holy Knights right now, where they can't be permanently harmed, but apparently they do still grow old. But the perpetual youth recipient, in theory, can be harmed, but will not grow old, although in the case of Gunko, cannot be harmed because there's also a mix of Emu regeneration narrationing powers. Now, with that said, we have been patiently, ever so patiently, waiting for the payoff of Law's devil fruit, which was set up all of the way back in Dressrosa, as we do know that there was a previous user of this fruit who became something of a historical legend. In Law's flashback, father of Diaz Break, Diaz Barrel, said the following about the Opeopinami. According to history, someone once ate this fruit and cured so many diseases with miracle operations. That doctor went on to be known as a legend, and you can tell quite a bit by the use of the word history as opposed to, say, legend or myth. This is history. This is an accepted fact, which, even the One Piece itself isn't an accepted fact around the world. It's only recently in the history of the series did we even confirm that it existed. It took the diary of Kozuki Oden to do so. And I really want to emphasize that the person saying this was Diaz Barrels. So this history occurred recently enough for even a dropkick like Barrels to have known of him. And it's also suspected that this previous user performed the perpetual youth surgery, and that is what made him a legend. The fact that he was such a prolific doctor that he gave a patient eternal youth, and that's why the value of the Opeopinami skyrocketed to 5 billion berries. Because this eternal youth business wasn't just an old myth about fictional fruit. We saw it happen in the history. And to bring this all the way back around to Gunko, we do know from her flashback with Brook that this girl's probably in her 60s at the very least, potentially 70s. And maybe there is a pretty fun payoff to be had with the legendary historical Opeopinami user having been forced to give Gunko perpetual youth so that she can be used as a vessel by Emu. But also, Emu does have enough crazy powers going on at the moment that it could be any number of other options as well. I find it hilarious that Emu is literally the edgy fan art of what certain people in the fandom drew up for Gear 5 originally before it was released. It is a bit like that. If you're relatively new to One Piece, or specifically One Piece fan culture online, then you may or may not have been around for this. But ever since Gear 4th happened on Dressrosa, there was a good 7 years of intense speculation of what Gear 5th was going to look like. And for quite frankly, an embarrassing amount of years, the design that became most prominent was this very aggressive haki-clad Luffy. And look, in mild defense of this was because Gear 4th did portray Luffy as a much more serious figure than his base form. So one conclusion to be drawn from that would be that Gear 5th would be a lot more serious, like peak serious, which is an idea that I despised to my very core, and when Gear 5th finally did show itself, the sheer joy of this form gave us the meme of the virgin Gear 5th edgelord versus the Chad Nika god. And I really do love that with Emu right now, we are seeing the edgelord form manifest as the direct opposite of Luffy. These very dark, sinister, and above all violent beings, which isn't just represented in Emu, but also the Domi Reversi targets. And it's getting to the point where I really want to see Luffy back in the actual main meat of the story, because I would love to see how the drums of liberation interact with these demons. On Egghead Island, when the drums were particularly active, Dory, Broggy, their flagship, and even the water around them were all dancing uncontrollably. They were subject to such intense liberation that the immense danger behind them was all but forgotten. So the drums might be the key to flipping people back, because what's stronger, Emu's corruption and his constrainment, or Luffy's freedom and his general being a good dude? Why using he for Emu? So I'm using he because I'm assuming that if Emu has spent the last 800 years wanking off to that portrait of Lily, then he's probably male. I do understand that Emu's gender has always been deliberately ambiguous, but let's be realistic about fictional pirates for a second. If there is some sort of love story being written in a shonen manga, even a one-sided stalkery love story, then chances are it's going to be between a man and a woman. Granted, right now, Emu is possessing a female body with Gunko, and I have seen some people believe that Emu's voice in the anime is female. I'm not entirely sold on that myself. I think the voice is distorted to the point where it's deliberately not giving a single thing away, and it becomes a bit of an auditory Rorschach test. You hear what you want to hear. So if you want to hear a woman, you hear a woman, and if you want to hear a man, you hear a man. Also, if you want to hear a child, you hear a child, which could also be a woman voice. And as far as the Japanese-speaking community goes, they seem fairly convinced that Emu's dialogue is very male. evil. So until proven otherwise, I'm just going to go with Occam's razor on this one. But also, it's deliberately ambiguous at this stage, so it doesn't really matter what you use. This made me think of the possibility of the five elders being originally part of Joy Boy's crew and then became Emu's underlings by her magic. So that would be the saddest possible outcome. To hop into a Void Century flashback and to watch Joy Boy recruit each of the five elders. J. Garcia Satin, join my crew. I do think that probably would be a bit too much even for One Piece. Sometimes bad people can maybe just be bad people. But I could also see each of the five elders being former kings that Joy Boy was maybe on good terms with, like how Luffy has his collection of kings that love him. I actually find it more likely that Emu may have used his powers on some that we already know were Joy Boy's comrades, such as Emmett. After waking up, Mr. Emmett apologized to Joy Boy in chapter 1111, and perhaps that was because despite his best intentions, Emmett was flipped in the original final war and ended up being forced to betray Joy Boy. And perhaps Joy Boy could have been on the verge of defeating Emu, like how Odin was about to kill Kaido, but evil plottings occurred that sealed both of their fates. And also one idea I did want to mention, this isn't mine, and I forget who put this in my comments, my apologies for that, but it was posed that Zunisha could also have been a victim of Emu's spellcasting, as in Zunisha wasn't originally an elephant. However, as part of his punishment, Emu turned Zunisha into an elephant and sentenced him to walk the seas for all eternity. And that might go some way towards explaining why Zunisha has one of those incredibly rare Emu-style eyes, albeit a different color to Emu and Mihawk, at least in the manga. What if instead of King Harold being reversied, it was Loki that was instead, and Harold sacrificed himself to turn Loki back after Loki injured Jarl? So that would be a very One Piece thing to do. For a father to tragically sacrifice himself for the sake of his son. Maybe Loki got a bit too full of himself and wanted to pursue the peak of battle power that is currently intoxicating Dory and Broggy, but ended up committing a couple of regretful actions that Harold had to pay the price for. I'm wondering if the book was created by a former awakened book fruit user. We saw the book fruit user could trap people in stories. So I don't think that the previous user of this fruit would have even needed to have been awakened to make this idea work. The book fruit is held by Charlotte Monteur in the modern day, and it's one of those abilities that was criminally underused, or at least undershown because it had so much insane potential. It could transport people into the world of books and trap targets in a story of Monteur's choosing, although these book worlds were purely illusory. However, he could also trap people literally within books, which he did to Luffy and Nami, but also for Big Mom's collection of rare living creatures. And he also used them to hook up an extensive network of Dendenmushis to communicate all throughout Totterland. But TLDR, if Emu's book was created by a previous user of this fruit, then each page could simply be used to store something or someone. In the case of chapter 1150, it would have stored the items needed to invoke Domi Reversi. Because Big Mom didn't need Monteur to access the books in her library, so in theory, all we need is for a previous fruit user to have created the book for Emu to use. And then what we need is for the powers to remain after the death of that fruit user, which, if it's true for Boa Hancock's Devil Fruit, then why not Miscellaneous Book Dude as well? Has everyone forgotten about the Luiano message at the beginning of Elbaf? Will that ever be answered? So I am starting to have horrible feelings that this might become one of those classic One Piece non-mysteries, like the Egghead Silhouette or Marco's Letter. We give Oda a lot of credit for foreshadowing and mystery planting, but sometimes things do lack resolution, especially in the modern arcs. And so if this doesn't turn out to be some cryptic warning about time dilation or whatever else could have a massive impact, then this is a sort of thing that will probably be answered in an SBS segment, like the answer to who gave Luffy the food during Egghead Island. What if the God of Earth and God of Sea are not Devil Fruit users like Luffy, but a reference to Zoro and Jinbei? Kind of like how Usopp became a god, so too will Zoro and Jinbei. You know, it's very interesting that you do bring that up, because we have our four named gods, Sun, Earth, Forest, and Sea, and that fits almost perfectly into our monster quartet. After the reveal of Zoro's family tree in an SBS segment, it was very quickly pounced upon that Zoro's mother's name is Terra, meaning Earth, while Sanji's mother's name was Sora, which in Japanese means sky. And between them, you've got the sky and the earth on Luffy's side, but when you add Jinbei into that mix, he's also got the sea fighting for him. It fits almost perfectly. Luffy is the sun god, Jinbei is the sea god, Zoro is the earth god. The only one that doesn't quite get us there is Sanji, because he's all about the sky, and our leftover god is the forest god. But regardless, there is a strong environmental theme that Oda has been working towards with our crew, and even with Nami being about weather in general. And not just that, you've also got very distinct areas of humanity. You've got Robin representing history, Frankie with engineering, Chopper is medicine, Brooke is the arts, Usopp is, he's whatever's left over, a god of that. And in the end, our whole crew seems to be designed to represent the sum total of humanity, eventually coming together in order to defeat the darkness that plagues us. Haki comes in many different forms. There's the looking one, the punching one, and the I will dominate the entire universe and the universe's mother one. But that's not quite it. Because there is a mysterious fourth Haki-based force out there in this world, one that we've all seen but never properly identified until now. Hello and welcome to the Grand Line Review, your source for everything One Piece. My name is Liam and I was probably being just a little bit overdramatic in that intro. I'm sure this has been discussed somewhere before, but not here, not by me, and not to you by me. Haki. It's a thing. And while we've spent most of post-time skip One Piece exploring the tenets of observation, armament, and conquerors, there is a fourth mysterious force out there. Something that as of right now, we only know as the voice of all things. A very intriguing innate ability that seems to borrow aspects from each previous Haki brand to result in a fun way to talk to objects, animals, and even objectimals, which are strange object-animal hybrids, of which One Piece does have several. But why do I think the voice of all things is Haki related? Well, reasons that I will explain after revealing that our subscribers of the day are Riley Cunningham, Boy Chap, and FBI, which, wow, the entire FBI apparently, who all did an amazing thing, which was listen to the voice of all things telling them to press the subscribe button for the Grand Line Review, which, by the way, doing so will result in consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed. So if you want to be our next subscriber of the day, then hit that button and please do say hi in the comments below if you are a new member of the Grand Fleet. Welcome. Now, what is the voice of all things? Well, it's a very vaguely defined ability to access a form of divine communication, and this is far more OP than it initially sounds because communication is the key to many things, be it a successful relationship, maintaining a supply chain, or adventuring alongside your fellow fictional pirates. Because the more good you can convey a message, the more gooder it is for your overall endeavor. But the major emphasis on the voice of all things has to do with listening, because it allows the user to hear the words or the intent of the entire world around them. Both living and non-living, you can hear their story. And sometimes those stories can be quite juicy and lead us to hidden discoveries such as wonderful poneglyphs. In fact, this is how infamous Playboy pirate King Goldie Roger found almost all of the sneaky stones, and on one occasion he even stated, "It was easy to find this stone. It's packed full of strong voices." It's a story of great power, isn't it? Which, interestingly enough, means that we need to adjust our criteria for becoming the Pirate King. In order to become what Roger was, you need wealth, fame, power, and highly tuned active listening skills. Of course, Roger was also able to hear the voices of living things that were unable to communicate via human speak, such as the Sea Kings, but the voice of all things also works the other way around. Instead of doing the listening to the talking, you can also do the talking to the listening. An example of which would be Momonosuke commanding Zunesha to engage in elephant-based combat with Jack in what I would describe as a Mobius strip battle because it was completely one-sided. But this ability is even rarer than Conqueror's Haki. So much so that there's currently only 4.5 characters in the series who possess it. As stated already, the most prolific of which was Goldie Roger, who has displayed the greatest mastery of the power thus far. Kozuki Momonosuke is also a confirmed voice user, as is the owner of the testicles from which Momonosuke spawned, Kozuki Odin. Then of course we have our protagonist, Monkey D. Luffy, who may very well be credited with the first displayed use of this ability in the series, because as early as chapter 13, Luffy was seen conversing with Choo Choo, who said, "Ruff, ruff, ruff, ruff." Or I don't know, however you pronounce his dog language, which I'm assuming is either Doglish, Doganese, or perhaps even Dogwegian. In any case, Luffy heard Choo Choo's message loud and clear, and he replied, "Thanks, good luck to you too, dog." Thus very potentially becoming the first voice of all things user in the series, even if it may have been, yes, an unintentional addition at the time. And as for our half character, that would be Charlotte Pudding, a member of the Three-Eyed People who can allegedly awaken the ability to hear the voice of all things. Although because Pudding in particular is only a half-blood member of the species, this may never be a possibility for her. Things do get quite tricky now because the voice of all things does seem to have undergone some changes over the course of One Piece. The first time it was referred to with such a title was by Rayleigh in chapter 507. Another thing, Roger didn't actually decipher those ancient writings. We are pirates. There is no way our intellects could match the prodigal Professor Clover or the scholars of O'Hara. He being Roger actually, I should add, he was able to hear the voices of all things in in this world. That's all. Which would heavily imply that while Roger was not able to read the poneglyph writing, he was still able to somehow decipher the message imbued in them. And this idea was emphasized by a large maternal figure in chapter 853. I'm not going to screw up like I did with Roger. He used that strange ability to hear the voice of all things and read the stone, which is a much more literal explanation of the power, you know? He did the thing and he read my stuff. But that puts us in a bit of a weird area, because if that is how the voice of all things worked, then Roger never would have needed his fellow active listener Kozuki Oden to read the poneglyphs for him, because then the ability would need to be renamed as the voice of the vast majority, but not all things, not these things in particular. And so we have a bit of a sneaky retcon. During Oden's flashback, Roger stated that he had stolen a poneglyph rubbing from Big Mom, and Roger's abilities were clearly nerfed so that he could still hear the voice of poneglyphs, but he was not capable of understanding what they were specifically saying. I guess think of it as having a neighbor who yells in a foreign language. Yes, you can hear the sound and you do understand the emotional intent behind it, but you have no idea what the crap he's yelling about. All you know is that you want him to stop immediately because you're sitting in your office desperately trying to record a video about fictional pirates in between his outbursts of indecipherable rage. We've all been there. But what does any of this have to do with Haki? Well, firstly, because it's the straightforward logical conclusion. Because even in a series about a goofy rubber boy fighting against clowns, sandcastles, and biscuit men, well, even that series is governed by some form of loose logic. And in this case, you can pretty much boil every weird thing that happens in One Piece down to one of three causes: devil fruits, Haki, or realist painting. Generally, more of the first two, but Miss Golden Week certainly was something special, being neither a fruit nor a Haki user. She was just a very talented artist. But on this occasion, we're going to have to unfortunately discount realist painting and devil fruits, which just leaves us with Haki. And there is very solid grounding within this realm to examine, because the voice of all things initially does seem like a fairly simple escalation of observation Haki. In fact, it's fairly similar to an existing brand of observation, which is the power to sense the emotions of others. Otohime was capable of this, as well as Fujitora, and even Kobe awakened this ability at a very inopportune time, being gifted with the trauma of sensing the emotions of all of those being brutally slaughtered at the Battle of Marineford. The voice of all things isn't wildly different to that, it's just going a layer deeper and, well, assumedly with far less mental scarring. And instead of sensing the emotions of people, voice users become capable of sensing the emotion behind objects. Or perhaps emotion is a bad word, but the intent behind them. So in terms of poneglyphs, this may mean being able to sense the original intent regarding why each one of them was written. Hence why Roger can understand the vague meaning of them without being able to comprehend the specifics of the writing. But of all of the different types of Haki, observation is the most diverse. Different characters unlock different aspects of it. However, when it comes to the voice of all things, it appears that they share a key trait with Conqueror's Haki, being inheritance. Right now, it is heavily implied that the voice of all things is a genetic trait, one passed on from father to son in the case of Oden and Momonosuke, as well as one held by an entire race with the Three-Eyed Tribe. And of course, Luffy and Roger both wield massive Ds, so that can go on to explain their possession of it. But to date, no regular old dude guy has been shown to possess the voice of all things. And another point in favor of it being Haki based is that just like Haki, users of the voice of all things are capable of projecting it in order to speak. So it may very well be a combination of differing brands of Haki, if not an entirely new area altogether. Although interestingly, there are also characters who can use aspects of the voice of all things without necessarily having the ability. A prime example of this would be Shirahoshi, who through the wonders of Poseidon, possesses the ability to communicate with and even command sea kings. Although it's unknown and probably unlikely that Shirahoshi would be able to do this with non-sea life, let alone non-living things altogether. But we should also point out Zoro, as his classic Alabasta matchup with Daz Bones is an event that only appreciates over time, because it has been confirmed during the Wano that the ability to cut steel was, wildly enough, a usage of advanced armament Haki. But in addition to that, Zoro had a realization that sounds mighty familiar in retrospect. The falling rocks. I could feel something alive in them. Not just a present, something more distinct, like breathing. The rocks breathing. Trees with heartbeats of their own. The earth itself breathing. Which, while not exact, does sound awfully similar to the voice of all things. The idea that Zoro can feel objects as if they were living things. He also has a tendency to talk to his swords as if they were living things as well, managing to assign them with all sorts of different personalities as if they were his children. However, it would be difficult to speculate on Zoro being a voice user because he was on Zou and there was no indication that he could hear Zunisha speaking. So Zoro speaking to his swords might just be an early sign of mental decline after being hit in the head one too many times, resulting in an effect similar to an old man speaking to his tin can collection. Or it may just be another one of the iterations of observation haki, or even a combination of observation and armament, which mimics part of the voice-like effect. Although I suppose one of the biggest points against the voice of all things being haki based is that it currently has no clear correlation to willpower. Because usually in One Piece when you go rah then the haki, well it also goes rah, and then the one with the most rah tends to win. Then again, sometimes incredibly potent haki spawns in very unlikely places, like say Isa from Sky Island. To this day, this little girl thing is probably a better observation haki user than the vast majority of the characters in the series, and all Isa does for a living these days is sell balloons, so she really didn't need to invest a tremendous amount of willpower into her abilities whatsoever. Whatever the case, it's not out of the question, considering what we know about haki, for a handful of people to simply be born with the voice of all things variation. In fact, that's exactly the case we'd need to accept whether it was haki or not, actually. At the moment, it just feels odd for it to be an entirely separate power, given how well a lot of it fits into the established haki system. But then again, it could be, because who am I to say otherwise? So I'm going to give the final say to the collective wisdom of the Grand Fleet, and whilst it was actually an incredibly close poll, a slim majority of you do feel like the voice of all things is in some way connected to haki. Except for Artie Pickles, who abstained from voting and simply said the following: Haki Maisaki, or Haki Maisaki, or maybe a combination of both. Something to do with ballsack. I don't know what that means, but I probably won't be doing it. Instead, what we will be doing is another video, watching it to be precise, like this one. It's about One Piece and such, because there's always so much more to learn, explore, and experience with this wonderful series. So I look forward to seeing you there.